All right, good morning. I'd like to call to order the regular Corporate and Administrative Services Committee meeting of Thursday, January 23rd. Thank you all for being here. Obviously, there's something on the agenda you want to address. I'd like to acknowledge that we're within the territory of the Shishelt First Nation. So we have an agenda in front of us. First, there was a revised Annex C passed out when the original annex, when the agenda was converted to PDF. There were some errors in the table numbers. So when we looked at the recommendation and it said table 11 and we went through the package, there was actually no table 11. So a new revised annex has been passed out to the directors, and it has been posted on the website. Right, so it's up on the website. So other than that, are there any additions or deletions to be made to the agenda? Nothing from staff. Director Pratt.
Just as in recognition of members of our audience that are here for the wastewater conversation, I'd like to ask that we add a 5 to 10 minute question period after our delegation, but maybe before we go into the reports with staff, just to hear any questions that might be coming from the public regarding the wastewater conversations.
You're okay with that? Okay. Sorry, go ahead. 5 minutes. 5 minutes? Okay, 5 minutes. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? Okay, so we'll add in, so that would be after 3 and before report 4. We'll have a 5-minute session of questions from the gallery. All right, anything else? So I'd like a motion to adopt the agenda as amended. Moved and seconded. All in favor? Thank you. And we have a delegation. She's sitting right in front of us. Denise Woodley. Turn it over to you. And do you have a PowerPoint presentation as well?
I do.
Okay, so we'll kind of scoot out of here. Thank you.
I'm up. Okay. All right. Hi, my name is Denise Woodley, and I'm the Director of Program and Staff Development at Sunshine Coast Community Services. With me today is my new manager of the Together Against Violence programs, Carol Wainwright. She just started yesterday, so she's here to meet everybody and also to check out what we're going to do. So I'm here to present a presentation about police-based victim services and local government partnership and sharing of the funding of the program. Just really quickly, the mission of police-based victim services is to provide victims of crime and other traumas, their family members and witnesses emotional support, practical assistance, and appropriate referral to community resources. And the goal of the program is to reduce further trauma associated with victimization and to empower the victim. By law, provincial law, any victim of a crime is supposed to be offered victim services. Not everybody takes it, depending on what the crime is, but RCMP on the coast are supposed to offer that to people. So why am I here? So the need of the community has grown over the last 3 years, over 300% in referrals and numbers of victims. So we get a file, it's a referral, but within that one file, within one crime, there could be multiple victims. So last year, 448 community members accessed the program. And why we're here is because of how the staffing or how the funding is supposed to be shared. So, and the need of the community has grown, especially, pre-2016. But it's just continually grown because of population size and just what's happening on the coast and everywhere. So we need more staffing to make sure that the community's needs are met. So in 2015, we worked with the District of Shishelt and the other local governments to provide funding to the program. It was every year we were applying to the grant and aid programs of all the local governments, and we were getting piecemeal grants, and the time commitment and going through grant and aid to try to come up with the other part of the funding was really time consuming. But in 2015, we worked with the District of Sechelt, and they came up with it was new at that point, a 3-year granting program for not just this program, but for other programs. And so we were successful, and we had on average getting $42,000 over 3 years, like with a minimal 2% increases over 3 years, to help fund the other half of the program through their 3-year granting program. The Sunshine Coast Regional District and the town of Gibsons did come with like $500, $1,000, depending on the year. The Sechelt Nation did provide some like $500 one year, $1,000, but it was really focused on the training, and the program has morphed over the years from having one victim service worker and some crisis workers that worked on call that were semi-volunteers that got paid when they were called out to two victim service workers, one full-time victim service worker and a part-time one that works up to 19 hours a week plus covers the full-time person when they go on holidays. And the reason for the change was the provincial funding system doesn't cover, and it's not mandated to cover on-call and overnight and weekends. But what we were managed to do was to create the second position. So we have a victim service worker in the office 6 out of the 7 days a week. So it was moving forward, our 3 years came to an end, and we put a proposal through to the District of Sechelt with an increased funding to try to come closer to matching our provincial funding. And from that, and it was in the paper, so it's not a surprise that the District of Sechelt was like, we want to take this out of grant funding and putting it into a line item in the budget and roll it in with the RCMP budget. So currently the Ministry of Public Safety and Solicitor General covers 50% of the budget. And in our Schedule E with the contract, it does say that at minimum, the ministry expects local governments to match the contribution, and this cost-sharing approach recognizes the critical role that police-based victim services plays in the community. So, and this is all in your package, it's a 50-50 share between the local governments with populations of 5,000 or more, and where the police strength is 4 or more. So I slipped this slide in because I wanted to go back in time a little bit. So this one isn't in your package, but so this is how it breaks down into population served. So so it should say 2017. The breakdown of victims where they're living is by, and this is the percentage. So it's quite even where we see how we're serving the community. So blue is the Sunshine Coast Regional District, at 38% of the population that we served through 2017. And the District of Sechelt is 33, and the town of Gibsons was 26, and 3% of the folks that we served was from the Sechelt Nation. And again, in 2017, it's a little bit more heavier in the District of Sechelt. We actually had over 500 people that we served in 2018. And then last year, it was fairly even with again, with the breakdown of where people came from that we served. So what I did was I broke down the population per percentage and what would be split out. So the $73,000 is what the province provides yearly. Well, it goes up about 2%. And then I broke it down by population size. So amongst the regional district and their population, which between all of them has the biggest population, they would be providing $34,000 or just under $35,000, and then the District of Sechelt would be 24, and the town would be 11,000 based on population. I didn't include the Sechelt Nation, although they're like 2% of the population, so their contribution would be $1,500. I don't know if it would be worth it to split that up in between or roll that into the regional district. I'm not exactly sure, but that's why I didn't include them in the breakdown. And I included a package of a 3-year projected budget with like 2% increases from the province. Every year we find out what we get from the province, and it is based on service provision and like number of hours, as well as, I guess, what the government of the day provincially decides what they're going to give to the anti-violence sector. But we projected sort of what they've been the last 3 years, increasing our budget, which isn't huge, but I put that into the 2020 revenue. We have a $71,379 is what they're saying, although this year, usually we have to have our contracts all signed and budgets into them by the beginning of January. And this year they changed it a bit where they just wanted our staffing costs in. And then they're going to come back to us. And I think it's because there are some new collective agreements. And although these positions on the coast through our organization aren't unionized, we do have some unionized positions. And so we fall under SIA and their sort of wage grid, and so I think they're trying to balance all the different programs across the province and also maybe trying to come up with more money because wages in this sector have been low. They have slowly been increasing, especially last year to this year. So they asked us for staffing projection costs and then the other costs that are associated with mileage and training and those sorts of things. We're going to find out what our final budget is at the end of March. So I'm also thinking that they're going to make some kind of big announcement when the province does their budgets in February. Who knows? I don't know. But I just kind of projected out for 2021 and 2022 as well. And the breakdown is in your package. Any questions?
All right, I look to directors. Any questions of Denise? Director Hiltz.
Thanks for the update. The question I had was about that Schedule E and the 50-50 cost sharing. Is that got a historical context? Like, has that always been that way, or is this a new change from the provincial government?
This has been in the contract for a number of years. We have at different times, like 3 years ago, talked to the different levels. That's what came out of it, and I think it's been dependent on sort of what people see, who the people are sitting in your chairs and what they see as who's responsible for RCMP, because it talks about who's responsible for the RCMP on the coast. So I think back, and I wasn't in this position back then, but my understanding was that we did approach the different levels back in 2015, and different people said, well, we can give this much through our granting, but really because RCMP falls under the District of Sechelt, that they should be handling the majority of the cost. I do have a letter that was sent to the District of Sechelt about what that 50-50 cost sharing, and we have compared to say the town, Kelowna or some of the other smaller centers, we have 4 governments here, right? So it gets to be a little bit confusing where the province gives some money for policing and then the district is responsible, and then sometime soon when the town of Gibsons reaches 5,000 people, they're going to be having to be responsible for some officers as well, is my understanding. So it's a district-wide service. It's, we're located, the staff are in the RCMP building, but that's sort of kind of the history of that.
So the follow-up is the provincial mandate is the 50-50 split. So that provincial mandate goes back some years? Yeah. Like 10 years, 15 years? Do we have any? It's always been there? Or?
I don't know if it's always been there. It's as long as I've, at least 6 years.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Other questions? Director Tighe.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. And I thought those graphs were pretty interesting. One thing that struck me was that by population, the town of Gibsons seems to need more police-based victim services than the rest of the coast. I'm just wondering if you've got any insight on that as to why that is.
No. It's really what Police-Based Victim Services does is it covers a wide range of victims. So that could be anywhere from somebody having phone fraud, that is a victim of a crime, to domestic violence. So what happens with our domestic violence files is they're flowed through Police-Based Victim Services to our community-based victim services. And police-based focus on crimes and or victims, and that can be anything from a car crash to missing persons to a next of kin notification. So I can break those stats out more about what actually those crimes are. It does take a little bit of time, and our staff they track that. What are the actual crimes or the files, they call them, that come through? So it could be anywhere. Last March we had something like 20 next of kin notifications for sudden deaths, and that was spread out throughout the coast. And one of those things, that because our population is on the older side, any person who dies in their home the RCMP get called out and coroner gets called out and stuff like that. So we get called to those next of kin notifications sometimes. Sometimes the RCMP do it on their own, but we'll link up. But it could be anything from a plane crash to someone in a fight at a bar, to those are like all the crimes that get covered for police-based victim services, and as well as sometimes right up front the domestic violence. So if you want, I could get staff to break down what those crimes are, but it would take some time.
I guess my question is more about funding. I mean, your per capita funding makes sense, but we could also look at a per demand funding model, and those will be two different numbers that we would have to consider. And so I'd just like to hear from maybe the rest of the board as to which way they might be leaning.
Anybody like to weigh in? Director McMahon?
I do want to weigh in, but I'm wondering if this is not more appropriate for when we receive the report to have that discussion.
So the other thing too is that where people live doesn't necessarily mean where the crime or where the victim takes place. So for instance, if something happens where there's a missing person, that missing person could be missing up, hiking up at the, Skookumchuck, but they could be living in Roberts Creek. So that's the other thing that does happen too. So a fight could break out in downtown Sechelt, but the person lives in Gibsons. So that's the other thing. It's just to give you the heads up on that too.
All right. Any other questions for Denise? All right. Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Okay. And we'll move on to the reports. So first I'll take a motion to receive all the reports. Moved and seconded. All in favor? Thank you. So the report that we have in front of us for Annex B, pages 11 through 23, is the staff report with regards to police-based victim services funding. It also, in this package, talks about some of the other requests that have come forward. So, Director McMahon, did you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, there is a broader discussion, too, about how we continually seem to be expanding our services into what are more social services areas, which are not the traditional delivery of, water and sewer services that the SCRD does. And this is, of course, because the provincial and federal government are downloading expenses on us. And, of course, victim-based services is important. That doesn't mean I'm happy that the federal government is not paying for it. They should be paying full freight on this, in my opinion. It looks to me, just from the demand point of view, that the demand is fairly evenly spread between the three areas, the two municipalities and the rural areas. And so I would probably be a little more comfortable with a funding model that was like more demand-based, although I don't want to get into measuring it every year or anything that would be administratively burdensome. So I don't know how other directors feel.
Tina?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So on page 11, the staff report outlines a little bit of how victim-based services are typically paid for. So as such, the regional district is not responsible for police services, so neither is the town of Gibson, so that's already been articulated. Now, when a municipality has control of the police services, they also are then, through the province, are allowed to receive their traffic fine revenue. And I believe that's how this particular program is paid for through the District of Sechelt, according to the financial statements and what's been articulated. The regional district does not receive that funding from the province, and so if any other jurisdiction, whether it be Town of Gibson's or the SCRD, we would have to pay for that through taxation. And so that's the difference between the municipality funding the program or the regional district, is how we have the ability to fund it is different.
Okay, so on top of that, though, yes, we do get funding, we get traffic fine, but we tax for the RCMP, and we pay 70% of the cost of the RCMP, and that comes through taxation. So yes, we do get traffic fine revenue, but it's minuscule compared to the amount we pay for RCMP.
And as such, on rural tax notices, there's a separate line item. So it is similar. Rural areas do pay for, now what the budget is not completely transparent.
Director Lee.
I was just trying to figure out where all the sources of the funding come from, including the 50% that the RCMP do put in for the service. Not knowing the budget, we have no way of being sure. But they collect the revenue, the traffic revenue as well for the rural districts, but we don't see it. So therefore, one would assume it's part of that 50% that's coming back from the provincial government for this function. If it's not, it should be. So are we going to be paying twice is my question on the rural areas, because we do pay the cost for the police. We do it through our taxes, and the taxes are fairly high on the property owners, and that's how we pay for our share. The regional districts pay for our share of the police is through the property taxes. I want to be sure, because it's not readily apparent how the funding model works. It would appear that we are already paying on that 50%. At least that's my take. Perhaps Tina would know more about that logic, but...
Do you want to weigh in on that, Tina?
Well, it's been some years since I researched it. So it was about the 6-year mark when this transition from the province to shift the traffic fine revenue to municipalities happened. Now, how much of the funding that's coming from rural areas is going towards that? I think staff would have to do some more research. It's been some time since the last time I know I did it, or a previous staff to me. So we would have to ask the province for that. And the way they transfer funds to the regional district is through, small communities grants or those types of things. So whether or not there's a portion of that that's from any traffic fine, that's not readily apparent. It just means that rural areas or regional districts, or people who don't have control of the police services, we don't have control of those budgets either, and I don't know much about whether or not the municipality does as well, but that is the challenge with the regional district. It doesn't mean there isn't precedent of other regional districts providing this service. There are some, but staff would have to look into what that share is.
Director McMahon?
Right. So assuming that we wanted to set up a service, that is a fairly lengthy process and would not be happening in time for this year's budget in any event. Am I clear? Am I correct on that?
Yes, that is correct.
Time frame to set up a service?
There's a few steps. I think we would have to articulate who participates, so we'd have to bring forward a report. But best case scenario, 2021.
Go ahead.
So I suppose the question is whether we should suggest that they apply for a grant and aid for the coming year of more than $500, because I see the point that it's hardly worth it for small change. We can't, of course, guarantee what we're going to do because we have to weigh all of the grants and aid in a due process.
Okay, one of the other things that points out in this report on page 17, there's a list of other organizations that have come forward over the last while, and we know that Seniors Planning Table has come forward and has requested funding. They're not on this list. So there's a few others as well. So when we did the review yesterday, the agenda review yesterday, we asked staff if it's possible to set up like a community, I forget what we called it, community services function and have it fairly generic. I know you reached out to the province. I don't know if you've had a response on that yet.
Thank you. We haven't heard back from the province. The regional district does have the ability to develop a service like that. It would require some work on determining what level of service and what sort of parameters would go around it. It would probably be good to have it a fairly prescriptive service so it wasn't just a giant catch-all for anything anybody can think of. But we do have the ability to establish one.
Okay, so what you're saying is we would need to be prescriptive, like it's for victim-based, police-based victim services, it's for Seniors Planning Table, it's for such, whatever. We would actually specify what would be in there.
I believe that would be, if staff was coming forward with a report based on direction from the board, we would probably have some discussion and we want to see recommendations that was more prescriptive for a service that was like this. So it was pretty easy to tell what fit and what didn't.
Okay, Director McMahon.
Could we set up a senior government downloading service?
We could call it that. Any other? Director Hiltz.
Yeah, I'm going to weigh in. Yeah, the UBCM resolutions go back to 1994 and asking for the province to kick into more money. And other regional districts, the GIA, the grant and aid, cannot be for ongoing funding. So you'd have to come up with a specific project to follow the policy that we have. We're not following our policies necessarily in the grant and aid. So there does seem to be this gap of this social service, which is that 30 years old? 1994 at least, this ongoing, we're sputtering. We seem to sputter every time we come to these. So yeah, we at least need a report on this service, and the restorative justice and victim services have some economies of scope and scale that are possible there at a regional level. So yeah, I'm in favor of some kind of report coming back for this kind of service, because the community wants it. The community wants to pay for it, so the community should be able to weigh in and say, this is what we want to pay for. So I'd really like to, because part of that service creation is to going out to the public saying, do you want to pay for this? So I believe that's part of the service feasibility. So yeah, I'm definitely leading in favor of that kind of understanding the commitment to the service, and does the public want to pay for it?
So would you like to draft some kind of recommendation? Maybe staff can help us with putting something together so that they have direction as to the direction we want to go.
I would want to do it at the table today. I think it's something that could be in the work plan. I would be happy to put a recommendation saying that staff come back with a report, but I thought there was already a report in the works for restorative justice. I thought there was something already kind of in the background.
Youth-based victim services? Taff?
Yeah, there was a past directive regarding youth programs, but it doesn't include the broader scope. So we could sort of fold that in, but I would recommend, since we are changing the scope of what's being asked, is that staff bring forward a report at a future committee regarding police-based victims services, or do we want police-based victim service or social services like the police-based victim services.
Probably more
I don't
generic
want
would
to put words
work.
in your
Yeah.
mouth, but it's a little more generic because we do have a few items. I would also suggest that we also forward this particular request to the round 2 budget for further consideration, unless the board just wants to invite them to apply as part of the grant and aid process. That's probably most likely where it'll come to, because you've already received the information, so maybe that's just more efficient. It's just more deciding what you're going to be able to fund during round 2. You might have to top up your funds or something.
So the first part that you had, and then add on that this be referred to round 2 budget for a conversation. And I think Tara has something that she's drafted based on what Tina said.
That's grand. Thank you, Chair. Sorry, I was unclear if they were going to be invited for rural areas grant and aid, or you were going to bring the budget back for round 2. There was 2 options there, so. Okay. The staff report to a future committee in regards to the feasibility and options and requirements of a community or social service, and that Sunshine Coast Community Services Society request for funding be referred to the 2020 round 2 budget.
You might want to just add in community services, police-based victim services program, because they have a lot of different programs. Okay, does that cover off what we're looking for at this point? Okay. So is there someone who'd like to make that motion? We got first, we moved and seconded. Okay. And any comments? Director Pratt, Director Ties.
And I think, just to comment on it, I think the community has, it's clear it's beyond a want, it's a need. And we are being failed by the larger, with this downloading of services from the province as well as from the feds. So I would, after we've voted on this, I would like to suggest that we look at that further advocacy piece as well. If we were to bring anything to AVICC, it would be a late motion at this point, I believe, but we could certainly bring something forward to UBCM, as well as we could certainly write letters to the province as well as to the federal government on this issue. It's so important, and if with such a gap in funding, especially when half of our population lives within a rural area, we can't expect the District of Sechelt to be shouldering the burden for this.
Thank you. Director Ties and then Director Mann.
Yeah, and I think as part of that report, I'd like to see some clarity as to how the provincial police funding works for rural areas, and how it ties in, whether traffic fines create a discount for us in the rural areas, or whether the traffic fines are rolled in and and it pays for something like police-based victim services, and it's considered as part of those 50%. That's kind of so yeah, I'd like to see some clarity as to how RCMP is funded through the rural areas.
Okay, I think we should come back to that after we deal with the motion that's on the floor. And then because that sounds like a separate motion on top of what we're looking at. Director McMahon.
I'd just be interested in any observations that staff might have, perhaps in the report, about whether there is an administrative burden involved in creating a whole whack of these little tiny services that all have to be tracked and so forth. I realize the regional district model is supposed to be accountable for how we spend money, but to set up a service for something that's like $20,000 a year seems to me like it's just creating a huge amount of paperwork.
Right. Anybody else like to speak to the motion that's on the floor? All right. So, do we need the motion read back, or are we all clear on what we're voting on? Clear? Okay. So, all those in favor? Thank you. Okay. Director Ties, would you like to make a motion with regards to the RCMP funding?
Yeah, I guess motion that staff report back on the RCMP funding for rural areas, and how how traffic fines are a part of that equation, I guess. Traffic fine revenue.
Okay. Is there a seconder for that motion? Director Lee, any discussion? Very clear? All right. All those in favor? Thank you. All right. I think we're done with that. Thank you for being here. Yes. Director Pratt.
The advocacy letter, I think the advocacy piece, I would like to suggest that we bring this forward as a UBCM motion and maybe also potentially as a late AVICC motion.
AVICC needed to be in by the end of January. Turn to staff.
Thank you, Chair. The AVICC deadline is February 6th. And in terms of it being a late resolution for AVICC, typically they'll only accept resolutions that are emerging issues. So if it's something that existed already, they would typically refer us to submit it directly to UBCM.
Go ahead.
I had suggested late just because of the timeline and knowing where we are at and preparing the agenda for next week, so I didn't want to put that on staff. I'm fine with it coming to UBCM, but I do think in the meantime we should also be writing a couple of advocacy letters, not just to the province but also to the federal government. I'm just not sure which. I think there's a plethora of ministries that they should be written to or copied on. And I'd like the board's support in that. But I'm just not sure which ministries we should be writing to right now, and that might be a conversation with community services. But in this specific issue around victim-based services.
Might be also a conversation now with the RCMP, because they may know a little bit more about where that goes as well. So what would you like it to be at this point? That the board direct a letter be drafted and sent to provincial ministries or organizations and or federal ministries or organizations with regards to victim-based services or with regards to police-based victim services and funding, and that staff investigate which area or which would be pertinent, something like that, and that the board or the chair sign the letter?
Yeah, so the chair with staff can be directed to do that, I think, and I'd be happy to make that motion.
Is there a seconder for the motion, first of all? Okay, seconded. And then who'd like to speak to the motion? Director Hills.
Further to the advocacy piece, there is, again, looking, the Cambry Boundary already did the UBCM resolution last year. Part of the reaching out, I think, would be to reach out to regional districts who have already submitted resolutions to UBCM or AVICC, just to kind of cast the net and say that we're all in this together kind of thing, rather than just going it alone. I'd like to see that kind of broadened out, the copying at least.
Okay, Director Kroll, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I just want to thank Seashelt for, basically carrying the brunt of this, as Director Pratt said, essential service. Where the funding comes from, is whether you pay it out of fines that you've gotten back, it doesn't really matter. It's, people really need to be aware of the function that's performed. So along the line of Director Pratt, I think as coastal communities, whether it's the District of Seashelt, the Regional District, or the Town of Gibsons, we have to bring this forward with one voice to AVICC and UCPM. So I think we should get together sort of on the side and, come up with, that everyone signs the letter, that it's, a common voice, because the crime doesn't really know the boundary, whether it's Seashelt or the District of Seashelt or the Town of Gibsons. It's something that has to be dealt with in the community.
Would you like to propose an amendment to the recommendation that's on the floor? That the letter be signed by?
Joint by all coastal communities.
Okay. Seconded? Okay. Any other questions or comments? Are we clear what we have? I think Tara's kind of wordsmithed that, and we'll work with it a little more. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, vote on the amendment first. All those in favor of the amendment? Thank you. And then all those in favor of the amended motion? Perfect, thank you. All right, we're done with that one. Thank you very much. Yes, Director Hill.
Yeah, just a comment. We probably have people in the neighborhoods have seen those Crime Stopper and signs that are up there from 20 years ago. This legacy goes back to those signs, and I still get people asking, well, where is this service? The signs are up, they're fading. We're supposed to have block watch, we're supposed to have Crime Stoppers in the neighborhoods, and the signs are there, but there's no funding to. So that's what's left of the service is the signs on the side of the road. So it's a long-standing issue. So it'd be nice to kind of try as a board to kind of kick this one a little closer to getting some resolution in the next 3 years. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So we have another delegation. Peter Galbraith, come on down. Resident of Half Moon Bay, and this is regarding planned wastewater rate increases. Thank you.
Good morning, Chair Seegers, directors. Thank you very much for giving me a few moments here to talk. My name is, as you say, Peter Galbraith. My reason for addressing you today is to, I think, fundamentally reiterate some of the response that was given at the Area B Coopers Green meeting regarding the wastewater rate changes under consideration. What Mr. Doyle aptly referred to as consternation, I think that's a pretty good word, in the report that was attached to the agenda. I'm conscious of the 10 minutes. I'm going to try to keep it under that with a Q&A, but bear with me. I'm speaking as an individual. We haven't had time, given frankly, the speed that this exercise seemed to be going through, to organize what I would call a coherent community response. That's why I say I'm speaking by myself. I'm going to come back to that point later. A little bit of background, and then I'm going to touch on really, at a very high level, some key concerns. I live in the Square Bay area. I have a property as well in Secret Cove one, so I'm double hit by this. Also trying to sell the one in Secret Cove, and frankly, this will affect that process. I've lived on the coast for 10 years, initially part-time and more recently full-time. That has followed a 45-year career in consulting engineering, predominantly in the infrastructure sector, both locally in BC, nationally and internationally. So I think I can say I know this area quite well. Laterally, my career has not just been involved in crunching numbers, but on the managerial side and helping regional and municipal authorities try to deal with some of these challenges. I greatly appreciate the time and effort that people in your positions put in. It's a pretty thankless exercise, and I know you get faced with problems and you get faced with pushback from the community. But as they say, that's where you pay the big bucks. But I get it. I understand the challenges. I also understand, honestly, the problem with funding of infrastructure. This isn't just an SCRD issue. It's Canada-wide. It's been growing for probably 20 years. And frankly, I think most jurisdictions have been lax in addressing it. I won't pick out the SCRD, but most jurisdictions have. And it's coming to crunch time. It's not just sort of a theoretical issue. I'm focused on Area B, and I know that within the audience today, there's a sizable number of residents of most, if not all, of the four areas. And I'm glad that you've amended the agenda a little so that we can have some follow-on question and answer after this, because we were toying around with how do we deal with sort of the ability to present more than just my voice. So I think that it's really positive you've done that. It's also a moving target. You've had a report, you had fact sheets, now you have a revised report that was attached to the original agenda and subtly amended, I guess, but I don't think it changes the content of it. What I can say is that, for me personally, the recommendation that staff has come to you with, which is succinctly, let's put in place the user fees, the operations and maintenance side increases. There's some subtle tweaking you've done there from the fact sheets. But let's defer the frontage fees, the attempts to start building true capital reserves for a year. I support that. I think it's critical that you follow on and accept that recommendation from staff. If you don't, there will be huge pushback from the community. The community is worried, and frankly, it's angry. And I'll come back to that point as to why it's angry. I'll come back to it right now. The Cooper's again, I'm focusing on Area B. The Cooper's Green meeting was on January the 7th. The invites for that were dated mid-December. We all know what's going on at the post office around Christmas time. Mail gets delayed. It doesn't arrive, whatever, until after Christmas. So really, the timing of when people were notified about that public meeting, I was amazed that we were able to get the turnout that was there. And that partly came because a few people cottoned on to what was going on by digging into the SCRD files online and realized that what seemed to be a relatively innocuous invite for an open house meeting actually was really, really significant. So that's where there's anger. It almost came across unintentionally that you were trying to push something through with as little input as possible. Now, I know that's not the case, but people ended up reading it that way. And it had that aura about it. Also, many of the residents of some of the communities you're dealing with here are part-timers and go away for substantial periods of time. So there are people who still don't even know this is going on within the community. I found a few people 2 days ago that had no iota about it. And, you know, some of these people are down south in Phoenix or wherever. So you really had a timing problem with how this has all evolved. I think also the anger comes from we had to dig before that public meeting to find out anything, and all that we could find really was the 2018 original report that was done, that you look at it and it's saying, if you could interpret, I mean, it's not that they were hard to follow, it's just we had so little time. They were talking about raises of up to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 and above. Boom. So we, you know, really people going in had no iota as to what was going to come down in that meeting. I think the belief that they were well attended is actually understating the issue. If people had really understood what was going on, we'd have had 4 times the seating capacity at Cooper's Green waiting to sit in on that meeting. I think that I'm going to shift now to my comments on where you're coming from, and perhaps just suggestions, some of which seem already to be going to be adopted. I would have to say that the rates and the method of calculation that has been used results in what can ultimately only be called a punitive approach on property owners, particularly current property owners. Now, we could get into a philosophical discussion about the right ways to go about taxation and rates. I'm not going to try to do that. But there are other ways that this could be approached. Every policy decision made in the developing of the numbers that you've come up with at the moment casts the burden. They're conservative, and they cast a huge burden on property owners. There are other ways you can generate the finance. You do not, and it's unique to me to find a jurisdiction that wishes to generate all of the revenue in advance of spending it. Historically, jurisdictions do this by a combination of three funding sources. The good, I'll use the term good, the good ones will build a reserve, never 100 or 110%. That is out of this world. The second portion is debt financing, and the third is grants. I understand the problem with not knowing how to deal with grants when you don't know you're going to get them, but that's too easy of an out. It puts a huge burden by immediately walking away from the idea of grants in terms of your calculations. So historically, what I've seen is that these could be, for the sake of argument, a third, a third, a third, in terms of a financial model like this. What you've done going to 110% is plain wrong. Now, that's my personal opinion, but I believe you'll hear the same story from other people here that are familiar with how typically these issues have gone on. There's other points in there on the financials that I'm not going to get into. I think that if you accept the recommendation to defer the implementation of the frontage fee increases for a year, you give yourself the opportunity to step back, involve the community appropriately, and come up with a practical, supportable funding scheme. So, as I said earlier, I strongly support and recommend that you take on board what staff has said. Implementing the operations and maintenance pieces, you'll find some opposition to that, but it's probably more, one can probably get one's head around that more readily in the short term. So if that's what it is, so be it. But don't just defer this for a year and not involve the community in a well thought out fashion. Otherwise, the problem just gets slid down the road. It's a big deal. And just implementing graduated increases, it's sort of like painting the lifeboats on the Titanic. Ultimately, it becomes disastrous. So, it's not just enough to say, well, we can graduate the implementation of those sort of charges. The issue is you've got to reduce your expectations in terms of the gross amount you want to accrue through these sort of pre-spend increases. I'll leave it at that. If you have any questions for me, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Thank you. Any questions? Director Hills?
So your main issue is about the model for the amount of the capital reserves in the future in order to pay for the infrastructure. That's kind of the main focus that you have.
Yes, I would have liked there to be more time before you have to make the decisions you have to about implementing the operations and maintenance ones. So begrudgingly, I'm saying, okay, let's sort of buy into that. So yes, you're correct.
So I have a question for you. You're talking about 1/3 building reserves, 1/3 debt financing, and 1/3 grants. So what happens down the road when we've accumulated 1/3 or less than 1/3 and something happens, and then we take on debt? At that point, the people who own the property have to cough up money.
Absolutely, but that's historically how it's been. You're not breaking new ground there. What you are is in the model that you've put out in front. And so you can play with those percentages, you can do whatever, but the reality is that's what I've seen historically done. And as I said, the numbers aren't exact.
Okay, that's good. Director McMahon?
I'd just like to thank you for your comments because, of course, you agree with me, so you're right. So I had pretty much come to the similar conclusion is that the financial model proposed, while it was a good attempt to look at the problem and come up with an approach, we're going to have to refine this model. If there is one thing that I can absolutely guarantee about the next 20 years is that it's not going to look anything like the last 20 years.
Absolutely.
All right, Director Hiltz.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you a question. As a resident, and what information in the last 10 years have you received about this moment that we're coming to now? Like 10 years ago, was this on the radar? Like I've heard in the past that people were getting notices about how much expenses were paid for in more financial accountability in terms of the utility of which they participate.
I can't talk about that, particularly about the Sunshine Coast. I can talk about it in terms of my working career and what I was aware of. A business that I managed 15 years ago had asset management as a significant component of our consulting practice. So the issue was on the table then. People were starting to become aware of it. Many jurisdictions were buying into it. That's, I think, as far as I can go in terms of the knowledge and where this has been building from.
So the question was, as a homeowner, how much have you received in the last 10 years?
You mean as a homeowner themselves, how much have they received regarding asset management with regards to the regional district and their personal?
How much have you known about how your utility has been running as a homeowner in the last 10 years?
If I looked at, again, I'm trying to answer what I think you're asking. During the last 10 years, looking at the charges on our utility invoice, I was surprised how low they were. Does that get to your point? Yes. Okay.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Galbraith? And then, if not, we'll start opening it up to the gallery. Director Pratt?
Not so much a question, just a comment. And thank you, Mr. Galbraith, for coming in. And I'm sure the other directors have received a plethora of communication from their residents. I know my Half Moon Bay residents in Area B have been very, very prolific in their commentary and their letter writing campaign. And I just want you to know that I've heard you very strongly about what's been said and the concerns. And I was at the meeting at Cooper's Green and heard and answered a few questions as well. And it is a difficult position that we're in when we're managing assets, that the only way we can look after them is through the fees and through the taxation, and it's a struggle. And when you consider that the cost of any asset is typically 20% when you purchase it and install it, and then 80% over the lifetime.
Yep.
And then having to look at these very lengthy timelines and these very, very costly infrastructure items to replace further down the road. And it is a struggle. It's not unique to us. It is definitely across the country as we look and as technology changes. And you would hope that costs would come down, but they don't.
Nope.
And but I really appreciate that you've come today to share your point of view.
If I may add a comment onto that, because you've triggered one point about costs, they don't go down. I would also say that it is overly conservative to assume that they will keep going up at 5% for 85 years. That's if you're going to do that, you need to bring in net present worth, and that really hasn't been done as far as I can figure out in the way it's been calculated. So all of it's a great start. It sure as hell, excuse my French, caught everybody's attention. But now let's be constructive. So.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Thank you for coming. Thank you for your very eloquent presentation. And now we'll open it up to the gallery. All right. Yeah. Do we want to have them come to the front? Yeah. Okay. We'll start with the fellow with the striped shirt. Hi.
Walter Lowe, Secret Coat. Just a quick follow-up on your question of what did... I'd have to put my glasses on. It's the big talking it, sorry. Just to follow up on your question of what we knew. I didn't know anything, and I do kind of read my notices, et cetera. I didn't realize this was an issue. We own properties in Vancouver, Stratas, and for at least 10 years, we've been required to either do a depreciation report or defer it, knowing what our capital expenditures. So all the properties we own in Vancouver, Strata properties, we know what that expected bill is. My ignorance was I assumed something similar was being done here, and it was my fault. It was my assumption. I didn't realize. If I had realized that things like capital replacements weren't being built into whatever our funding was, it would have been a question I might have actually brought up. Sorry, that was just a follow-up. I appreciate Peter's comments. I appreciate the work that's been done. I've gone through the November report, today's meeting. My ask is I would like more access to the actual financial part of the models. I'm not an engineer, but I have done lots of work on capital projects in the sawmilling industry in terms of buying either equipment or building brand new plants, so I'm fairly familiar with that. I've gone through the numbers in the report. I've tried to interpret it from the graphs. My quick look at the recommended Plan 2 option says we're going to borrow somewhere around $1,050,000 at the time of the plant's construction, and that will be paid off in 2042, leaving another 38 years of expected life of the plant. So to Peter's point, in terms of looking at how that funding works and the assumptions, I'd like access to a little bit of the modeling, happy to participate if that's allowed, to see if we can't come up with something that's a little more equitable so that those users for that next 38 years bear some of that cost. Peter's comment about net present value, again, is an important one to have some thoughts on. If we took out that loan for $1,050,000 at 6% on a 50-year amortization for Secret Cove, that's roughly $1,800 a year in that financing fee, and that's a flat fee. That $1,800 that we'd be paying in 2029 is going to seem like a big amount of money. Assuming incomes grow at 2% a year over that next 50 years, that $1,800 in, not going to look at my notes because I won't find it, in 2065 or whatever, or that at the end of that period, will feel like $92. So there are lots of ways to look at how you want to do this, but we also have to remember the future value of money means whatever that big number looks like today will not feel like a big number 40 or 50 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Frank, right? Come on down.
Thank you very much.
And just pull the microphone a little closer to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. My name is Frank Belfry. I'm a resident here in the Sunshine Coast for the last almost 10 years, landowner for almost 30 years, now living here full-time. And I'm a resident of the Curran Road Wastewater Local Service Area. And I'm also a retired professional engineer, worked in municipal infrastructure all my life, 40 plus years, similar to Peter Galbraith, as a consulting engineer working in municipal servicing. And so this is not a new issue to me. I'm quite familiar with it. So also my career encompassed many roles, responsibilities of being a senior engineer as well as president of the consulting engineering firm that I work for. So I won't take much time, but I just wanted to say I agree 100% with what Mr. Galbraith said. He did it very eloquently here. He did it very eloquently at the January 7th meeting for those who were in attendance. But I just wanted to give you just a brief summary of why the angst that's been developed in the neighborhood, because at your November 28th meeting, there were some, and I've talked about the Curran Road issues that were presented in that report, suggested a sort of a combined user fee, frontage fee of in the order of $4,000 a year, up from about $600 a year. That's a substantial increase. That then at the January 7th meeting, there was an information sheet came out, and it showed recommended a 10-year stepped increase up to 10 years from now, a little over $5,000 a year fees based on the formulas and things that Peter Galbraith described. So that the angst that developed at that January meeting prompted a letter writing campaign that Director Pratt referred to. We plugged up her email box as well as regional district staff, and prompted the people who are here today. So we thank everybody for the efforts they've put in. I think we all recognize that that the local residents have to pay their fair share, but what is the fair share? And the costs are going up. You have a report in front of you, which I hope you will endorse, that the user fees go up. We recognize they go up in the situation of Curran Road, the O&M budget going from $21,000 to $31,000 a year, probably well needed. I can agree with that. I do have some questions on it, but that won't bother the people here today. But I think what has to happen is that working with the residents to come up with a program for the frontage fees and developing capital reserves that is reasonable, affordable, and practical. Again, those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the gallery who'd like to come forward? Okay. We're at 7 minutes. I've kind of extended. I think we're going to be up to 10. Okay, so.
Madam Chairwoman, Directors, my name is Walter Coley. I'm representing Painted Boat Resort. I'm looking at it from a business angle, and I'm keeping this very brief. In our situation, Painted Boat maintains the assets. We pay for it, we maintain it, we pump it every year. We have septic fields, so when I read this, I'm getting a little bit alarmed. I looked at the increases of 25% in the paper dated January last year. And so a 25% increase, and the second option was named 50% increase. So the 25 sound like a bargain. As a business, I kind of ask myself, where could I increase my revenues by 25%, or where could I charge 25% more? I'm kind of in a very kind fashion asking, what am I really paying for, since we are maintaining the assets? Since we paid for it, and most likely will have to replace them in the future. So there should be maybe a separate category of rates for businesses such as ours. Any questions? Or I promised I would keep it very brief. Okay?
Are there any questions for a gentleman? Director Tighe?
My question might be more to staff, and that is, does Painted Boat receive less service from our staff than the other facilities? And in that case, yes, should there be some compensation?
Thank you, Chair. No, they don't receive less services. We attend Painted Boat and do the work at the plant regularly.
May I comment on that? Thank you very much. I don't want to diminish the work. I just say our observation is that basically Yes, we are being monitored maybe twice a month for a few minutes. So I really think since we are maintaining the assets, we pay for them, we pump them out regularly, I really think you should give that some strong consideration to maybe create a separate category for a business such as ours. We are on the Sunshine Coast. We are getting hit with all kinds of increases, and my aim is to actually keep it sustainable so we can continue to pay wages, so we can continue to flourish as a business. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. We are now at, sorry, I'm going to get back into my timer here. We're just over 10 minutes. How would the board like to proceed? Vaughn, there's nobody in the gallery jumping up and down? You've heard? One more?
Sorry, just a real, very short comment. This is, with respect to him, it is 100% of our money. So we're not looking for a contribution from the SCRD to pay for our plans. We have recognized we will pay for 100% of it. We're asking for input into finance.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move on. So we have a report in front of us. And Kyle Doyle, are you looking to present on Annex C?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to give a quick introduction here. So good morning. My name is Kyle Doyle. I'm the asset manager here at the Sunshine Coast Regional District. I want to thank Mr. Galbraith and the rest of the public for coming today. It's great to see the public engagement, and it's very useful for us to get feedback like this. The SCRD has been managing wastewater services in the Lower Sunshine Coast since the early 1980s. There's been a 50% increase in the number of wastewater services in the last 15 years. In 2018, gaps were identified in the delivery of service, which prompted a further review. Initial steps were taken in 2019, which indicated the need to increase fees by 25% as a catch-up to make up for a lack of increases in the past. Following that, the need for additional staffs were approved by the board, as well as another vehicle to be able to facilitate the increased level of maintenance that was required. We have conducted a more thorough review of each individual wastewater service, and the results were presented to the board at the end of November in 2019. Staff then engaged with the public. We had 5 engagement sessions between December 9th and January 8th. Approximately 150 residents from the 720 parcels were able to attend the sessions. I want to thank all the residents that showed up and the directors for participating in these sessions. We did receive significant feedback with over 90 emails, multiple phone calls, and several in-person discussions. The feedback covered a broad spectrum of concerns, and additional information was provided about the residents' wastewater services. As a result of the feedback, staff recommend that the consultation with the local service areas continue in the coming months and the rest of the year, and we move towards achieving a sustainable financial model that has consensus with the residents. It's recommended that wastewater services universally move to a funding model where user fees pay for operations and maintenance costs, and frontage fees are allocated towards capital expenses. This transparency, I think, is being kind of accepted amongst all residents. We also recommend that user fees are increased to levels sufficient to fund the 2020 operation and maintenance budgets for each service area, and that the 7 service areas with minimal reserve balances contribute annually to ensure minimum reserve targets are met within 5 years. The following item on today's agenda is a presentation about grants we're applying for. We're looking for board approval to apply for these grants. If these are approved and the grants are successfully obtained, adjustments to these operation reserve contributions would be made. We do recommend minimal adjustments to frontage fees at this time as a response to the public feedback we've received. We hear that more consultation, more information, and a better consensus is required. So we agree upon that. We recognize that at this time we haven't communicated perfectly, and we can improve that. There's a minimum frontage fee. We want to bring some of the basement, the lower ends, up to a common lower denominator of $102 per year. And that just gives us a steady annual contribution at this time for capital reserves. Table 11 in the staff report that most people seem to have summarizes our recommendations, and I want to thank the board for their time today and consideration.
Thank you. First of all, I'm going to point out, if you haven't looked at the new revised package that came out, page 39 doesn't say table 11 in the old version, but that is table 11 that they're referring to. So you can see that those are the fees. So page 39. All right, so Director Pratt, question.
Just a comment first, I think. First, thank you so much to staff for going out and doing the consultations. I attended a couple of them, and I know they were not easy. And thank you for the breadth of information that you've provided, and also and coming back to us with this report with very much the community's point of view in mind. And I appreciate that the suggestion in getting more community consultation. That's really very, very clearly what we heard, and I appreciate that. And thank you so much for taking up your evenings to do that conversations with the community.
All right, any other director? We'll go Director McMahon and Director Lee.
Oh, I have oodles of comments, but it's clear that we're going to have some sort of staged approach to this, because we've got each one of these systems is unique and is facing different challenges, and some of them are more urgent than others. So what I would like to see is a plan of attack where we kind of lay out what we're going to tackle in what order. I appreciate the comments on communication with 20/20 hindsight. I think we could have done better. On the other hand, with respect to staff, it is very difficult to communicate with residents. I know that at Wood Creek Park, we sent out letters, there were articles in the paper, the community association covered it in their newsletter. They even went door to door, and there's still people saying, well, nobody told me. So it's hard. It really is. I have a number of questions, one of which is how much consultation is the right amount? Because as I understand it, to dissolve a service would require a vote of over 50% of the property owners. So if we are going to come up with a plan that has significant costs, should the property owners weigh in? I don't know. What is the proper procedure in this situation? The bigger question that this raises for me is why we are approving these sewer plants in rural areas. Or I shouldn't say we here, because the SCRD is not approving them, the province is. But looking at these numbers suggests to me that this is not a sustainable model. And if an area cannot support conventional septic, should we be developing it? Because if the residents in the long term cannot afford to replace this infrastructure, why are we building it? And I would be very interested in taking a look at that, because I know roughly what the costs for my house are for a conventional septic system. And yes, one day I will have to replace it, and it will be a whack of money. But it's nothing compared to the level that we're talking about for some of these plants. So, I'm back to, should we be approving these, and should we be taking the responsibility for them? And finally, in some cases, we may be looking at dissolving some of these very small services. At least the residents certainly are interested in that question. And since I have Sunnyside, which is the oldest, smallest, and weirdest of the systems, one of my questions is, if we were to dissolve this rather than continuing it, could the dissolution of the service be funded through our existing reserves? So I would like to know this. I would like to know what all of our options are. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, did you want to make a motion to that effect around that piece, the dissolution piece? Staff?
So I think you can, yeah, of course, the board can make a request to staff to look into what steps would have to be undertaken in order to dissolve a regional district service. What I can say, though, is in order for us to do anything with reserves, we can't use those for any purpose unless they were intended. So if they were for capital, we can't repatriate them back to them or move them to an operating reserve. We've already checked that out with the ministry, so we know that's not available. So it is a little bit of a conundrum. There might be some other ways that we can explore that, but again, those are all facets of what would need to be contemplated to undergo a dissolution.
Okay. Did you have a comment on that quickly, briefly?
I believe personally these are fundable within, there may be the odd exceptional case, but by and large these improvement areas are fundable under the regulation that they have to be fully self-sustaining. I don't think it's a problem that that the model is broken. I think it's a large part of the issue here goes to the escalation that's been used on cost estimates and not looking at net present worth. If you take $100 and you escalate it at 5% over an 85-year period, you get $5,000. That is one of the reasons, and I know you haven't picked 80 or 85 years, but it's that element that has driven these numbers without looking back at net present worth. So I think it's a little early to say this model doesn't work financially.
Okay, one of the things that's come up inside of that conversation around, and in our previous conversations, was around the policy that the regional district has with regards to taking on the maintenance and servicing and capital repairs, et cetera, of the wastewater treatment facilities. And I think we are all clear that there is no defined policy in place, which could go back to when they're actually built. Somebody's coming in to build a subdivision of some sort. They're looking at putting in a system. Because we don't have a policy or anything looking in the future, there's not necessarily the input up front saying, do it this way or do it this way because of the long-term impacts. So I think that's something that staff are looking at and will be coming back with to us around that. There are some provincial requirements that we need to follow, but in past, there hasn't been any clear policies at our level to identify for the residents, yes, we would take this over, or no, we wouldn't take this over, so that we have direction and they have direction up front. So that's a piece that's missing, and I think staff are aware of that and will be working on that piece. Okay, Director Lee and then Director Ties.
Well, I had an actual technical question. I had two properties that were parcel taxes to pay for debt, but we didn't put any frontage fees on them. Specifically, Canoe Road and Merrill. Is there a reason we didn't put a frontage fee as well as the parcel tax?
And staff?
Thank you, Chair. So in consideration to the feedback we got from the public, we felt it was necessary to mitigate rate increases, especially on those two service areas where they have significant rate increases related to debt payments, changes in the system they're using, which have resulted in increased maintenance and as such. So that was the purpose for eliminating the frontage fee and just servicing the debt for the time being until we have further consultation.
Okay. And the way I understand this is we are still going to discuss the capital, but we're going to do it over the year next year. Is that correct?
Yes, if I could, Chair, just jump in a little bit. I think that in hearing a lot of the public feedback over the last few weeks, and again, some feedback from the board. And even today, I think that, staff can come back with some proposals. And, we have a lot of very knowledgeable, engaged individuals. I think if there's any positive outcome to that, we do have a lot of engagement for this initiative. And so perhaps, an advisory committee or something could be struck, realizing that each of the 15 plants are very unique and there might be some nuances, but they all have to address the same thing, which is sustainable funding. And I think the model with how we go about it, but I think that's something that staff are contemplating now is, we have these professionals who could assist with guiding and I think even help us be a conduit for the communities. So I think leveraging some of those assets in the community is what staff's looking at. So further information to that.
All right, Director Ties, and then it was Director Hiltz.
So, I generally agree with what our delegations here have said, and that the community needs to be involved and that each service needs to come up with a unique solution that serves their particular need as time frames, size of the facility, and the number of contributors differ for every facility. So the things that to consider are the choice of funding and what those choices will mean to their impact on not only your fees and taxes, but also the property value. The more you move towards debt financing and relying on grants, the more the impact will be on property values, because there will be some depreciation of the property value if you rely on that. That being said, I agree that a certain portion should be planned to be debt financed to create the opportunity for grants. Otherwise, if you don't do that, then there's no room for the grants to be able to act. So I think every facility needs to do what it feels right at this time. And in terms of Roberts Creek co-housing, for example, we've got a strata. The strata can go back to the whole community and sort of come up with a pretty cohesive plan, and they can probably vote amongst themselves, but they need to be given a report that gives them the options, as well as and some of the considerations might be, well, do we want to downgrade the system, or do we want to do it all with capital up front, or do we want to do debt financing? So these are some of the things to consider, and I think every facility needs to do it in their own way. And I agree with Director McMahon that there should be some sort of priority list, especially those facilities with a tighter time frame should probably be prioritized, so that we can get a plan in place for them and then move on in a somewhat cohesive fashion.
Okay, Director Hiltz.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, and I would like to weigh in and thank staff and the SCRD for having asset management. I look at that ANOVA Couch and Valley report for 2016. You think we're in the desperate straits? I'd sooner be here than over there. So I'm glad that the SCRD is building up that experience and moving all this stuff forward. I'm really happy with that, and previous boards have kind of implemented that, I guess, with staff's recommendations. So my question is kind of about the recommendations, and it goes to on page 29. It says implement a wastewater funding policy, and my question is, if we adopt table 11, are we by implicit, is that funding policy embedded in that table? Because it separates user fees and frontage fees. So I'm going, are we already adopting a policy by adopting the table? That's kind of what I seem to be seeing happening. And there is another further report in water that we take this pool of frontage and user fees and then we kind of shuffle it rather than having these discrete lines. So we don't have a policy, but we seem to be implementing a policy, and the table seems to implement that policy without actually having the policy. So that seems to be what I'm seeing. And that's what the recommendation says, we should have a wastewater funding policy. So I'm wondering if we're kind of doing it all together in that table.
Did you want to address that? Thank you.
Yes, I think that this is where it's The purpose is to create some more transparency with how a service is funded. And in looking at the legislation, there isn't anything prescriptive, but it most certainly is best practice when you look at any funding model for how you fund these particular local service areas. So since there isn't anything explicit in legislation and we don't have anything explicit in our financial sustainability policy, it alludes to it. We thought one of the recommendations that I've already inserted in sort of our budget debrief is to create some more clarity in our financial sustainability policy, even for when we create new services. Because you look at community recreation, Pender Harbor Pool, it is quite clear. Operations fund operations, or user fees fund operations or taxation, and parcel taxes typically pay for capital or debt. So we want to bring a policy. So are you, by approving this particular model, whether it be this one or the subsequent reports, you're moving towards it, but you still don't have a policy. It's just good practice. If staff bring forward a policy and it's not amended, is there any harm to that? Not necessarily. So by approving this, you're moving to a transparent financial model. It's not in policy, but it's best practice.
Follow-up?
So the follow-up, there is a staff recommendation, is to implement, does staff need a recommendation, resolution to bring forth this policy? Or is it kind of...
I don't need it. I've already flagged it, and I have it earmarked to come forward in April.
And I think we also, in November, when the reports came forward, I think we were on board with staff moving in that direction. So while this is not necessarily, like if we were to adopt this recommendation, the policy is not in place. And currently, I don't believe all of these fees that we're looking to implement would make that policy in effect now. Because we know we haven't increased some of the user fees, for example, to what was initially recommended. We're moving in that direction. This does not take us there today. Okay? So let's get to the report. Director McMahon and then Director Lee.
Okay, I also wanted to express my thankfulness for these reports that have come forward on the individual systems, because this is giving us the basic information we need to make good decisions. I get kind of the feeling that the fees previously were set by, I don't know, $100 sounds good. That not to knock staff, but you kind of wonder where these numbers came from. As far as staff's recommendations in Table 11, I'm very happy with the recommendation on Wood Creek Park. I'm just a little concerned about the reserve contribution for Sunnyside, because I'm wondering if we could be in a position of putting a reserve contribution in that we can't then use. So I just wanted to kick that back to staff to see if that has been considered in making that recommendation.
Staff? You're referring to the fact of the dissolution potential, where we put money in a capital reserve and then not necessarily be able to spend it. Staff?
Thank you, Chair. At this time, we haven't seriously factored in the dissolution possibility. There are immediate upgrades or work that's identified in the asset management plan, including the feasibility study for the future replacement of this system. The successful receipt of grants might reduce that contribution amount. We anticipate that we'd revise it if we got the grants. So to answer your question, we could reduce that reserve contribution. I think that the possibility of dissolution is a bit farther down the road, the understanding of that process, and making that assumption wasn't something we were prepared to do, that it was going to be dissolved.
Follow-up?
Yeah, it's just in that case there are indirect costs as well as direct costs. So if we end up having to dig up the sewer line between the properties, people have built fences, they have landscaping, they have outbuildings on top of the line. So the homeowners could be facing a bunch of additional costs, and that will be a factor in any decision that's made on that. But if we can spend the money, I'm happy to put it aside.
Director Lee?
First off, I'd like to thank staff for the speed that they did move at here to get this done. I'm on one of the plants. I'm on Lee Bay, of course. And I've often wondered, it didn't seem to me like we were putting enough money away for the replacement of that plant, and it always bothered me. Now I understand we weren't. So, but anyways, working through the surprises that we got as homeowners, I don't think you could have done it a different way in the time that you had. We have to all start thinking about it and figure out what we want. This is the first time I've heard the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, even though the concept to me was something I was struggling with because I was used to business cases and net present value and all that stuff. And the argument about the escalation, well, I am on a fixed income. I probably don't care 50 years from now anyway, so the person that buys my house probably won't be, if my house is still there. I did talk to members of our community about whether you would like to take your own plant over. And this, for instance, Lily Lake Village would be one that would be a possibility. The answer was very clear. Didn't want anything to do with it. They had enough problems already with all the groups they already have to do to manage a property like that, and they didn't need the added complication of a septic system. My brother-in-law lives in Sechelt, and he had his own septic tank. He was absolutely thrilled when Sechelt hooked him up. So there's not just the cost. There's the worry, and there is the time commitment of homeowners. A friend of ours lived just outside of Lee and has her own septic field, and it failed. And she desperately wanted to get hooked up to Lee Bay. And for some reason, I don't know why, the answer was no, but it was before my time. She's $50,000 in now. So I believe community septics are the right thing to do. You get a better product, it helps the environment, and it don't cost more. And I believe that the regional district running them is also the best thing, mostly because when it comes time to replacement, we get an awful good rate on money to get the capital. So a long way of saying I'm quite happy with Table 11. Thank you.
All right. Is there any of the directors who want to weigh in yet before we actually move something forward? Director Pratt and then Director Ties.
There's two things. I was going to move forward on the recommendations on page 24, but I had one question for staff first because our CFO had mentioned the possibility of a committee, which is, or like a wastewater committee, and I'm wondering if we wanted to get something, if the board was looking at something like that. I think with the expertise we have in the community, if we would need to maybe make a motion to that effect now, because it may have some budget consideration for the upcoming year or for the upcoming budget cycle.
So I don't know whether or not there's going to be a cost. I think this is just sort of an emerging issue that we've talked about in the last few days. So we haven't really put on paper what that would look like. So we could bring something forward as part of round 2 budget as to what that would look like. If you wanted to add a subsequent recommendation that be considered as part of the round 2 budget, we could do that.
Okay. I'd like to make a motion then to that effect that staff look into bringing forward a recommendation for a wastewater committee or task force, and as part of round 2 budget.
Is there a seconder for that recommendation? Seconded. Any other discussion on the recommendation on the floor? Now this is voting for rural areas only. All those in favor? Thank you. Okay.
And then I wanted to move forward on the recommendations on page 24 unless there's any further burning questions, so I'll move those recommendations.
Okay, is there a seconder for those recommendations? Seconded. All right, anybody like to speak to the motion? Director Hiltz? Did Director Lee want to speak to that too? No, Director Hiltz.
I'm supportive of Table 11 in the motion. The question before I vote is the Langdale residents have been waiting on the resolution to their system for at least 10 years. This is the coupling, uncoupling, recoupling issue of that, and a report was to be coming to the committee sometime in January. I'm just wondering what the status of that, of those negotiations are, as I think the residents would expect me to be asking that question before I vote on this.
Thank you, Chair. We continue to work on that. It's certainly my goal to come to a conclusion sooner than later. That's all I can say on that, really. We're still working on it.
Any other questions on the recommendation on the floor? Electoral areas only. All those in favor? Thank you. And let's move on to item 5. This is, sorry, I have to get to the right page. 122, Annex D, with regards to wastewater feasibility study, infrastructure planning grant program application. And turn it over to Kyle again to address this, or Tina. Who's going to address this one briefly?
Thank you, Chair. So this report is a ask for the board to approve the 6 grants we've applied for the infrastructure planning grant program. The purpose of these grants is to help finance feasibility studies for the 6 most critical wastewater systems that require upgrades in the near future. These grants are fully funded through operating reserves, and the successful grant being approved by the board and by the provincial government would be a benefit to all wastewater services involved.
Okay, so you're coming to us now. Timing was an issue in getting this before us. The applications have gone in for these, and they're looking to the board to move a recommendation to approve the application to go along with the application. Director Pratt.
I am very happy to move the recommendations on page 122.
Seconded. All right. Anybody like to speak to this? Director Hiltz.
Just a quick, so there's 6 separate grants then, rather than it's a bundle or separate?
Thank you, Chair. These are 6 individual grants. The structure of the grants is that the first $5,000 is funded 100%, and subsequently to a maximum of $10,000 is funded 50%. By doing them individually, we feel we have the best chance of receiving the most funding.
All right. Any other questions on the recommendation on the floor? All those in favor? Thank you. All right. We're going to take a break. Let the gallery clear out if they like, or they can stay for the scintillating conversations we're going to have for the rest of the morning. We'll take a break and come back shortly. Regional water surface, yeah, you mean if they're here, move it to the end so they stay for the meeting? Yeah, right. So this is Regional Water Service Area 2020 Rate Bylaw Amendment, pages 124 through 137, Annex E. And Tina, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So the bylaw to regulate the rates and operations of the water supply and distribution system for the Sunshine Coast Regional District is done through bylaw number 422, Water Rates and Regulations. Each year, as part of the financial planning and parcel tax process, the rates are reviewed for each water service and the respective rate schedules are amended. The primary objective in rate determination is setting appropriate, sustainable, and equitable charges and fees that help the utility achieve full cost recovery required for the service. The two primary sources of revenue are, of course, parcel taxes and user fees. In the regional water service area, parcel taxes are intended to fund capital expenditures, so acquiring or maintaining fixed assets. And user fees are intended to fund operational expenditures, so ongoing costs of running the service. Under the historical rate schedules for regional water service area, portion of parcel tax revenues were funding operations. And to address this imbalance, user fees need to be increased at a rate greater than the increase in operating expenditures. For 2020, over 33 budget proposals were brought forward for the board's consideration, with several projects already approved during round 1 deliberations. In each of the tables included in the staff report, the amounts identified as transfer from reserves include funding for those 2020 projects. Therefore, staff recommend a 43% increase to user rates and a 5.3% increase to parcel tax rates for an overall rate increase of approximately 25%. This will eliminate the allocation of parcel tax revenues to fund operations and increase net capital funding by $1.7 million. This will provide a clear delineation between operating user fees and capital funding going forward. And it'll also provide a modest increase in uncommitted reserve balances in anticipation of future funding requirements for the water supply projects. So pending board-approved direction today, the Water Rates and Regulations bylaw, Schedule E, will be updated and forwarded to a future board meeting for 3 readings and adoption.
Thank you. In your comments, you said that this incorporates the budget requests that have come forward. We still had some TBDs, though, in there. Are those anticipated in here as well, or would those necessitate further increases, or do we even know?
So, of course, the 2 items that were to be determined as part of the next phase of the water reservoir and the groundwater investigation, those have been considered in this model. However, as those particular projects refine ongoing, those would probably be reflected more accurately in 2021. So if anything, for example, was debt funded or anticipated to be debt funded, we understand that the debt funding wouldn't have to be incurred until 2021.
All right. Any questions from the board to Tina on the report? Director McMahon.
Well, I think if there's one thing that residents are expecting now, it's to pay more taxes for water. If they haven't got that message, then they've been living on another planet. And I'm just going to point out that the increase will mean that I will be paying $1.88 a day for clean drinking water delivered to my home 24/7 in pretty much unlimited quantity. And I got to say, that's still a good deal.
All right. Anybody else? Trust on it. She always brings that's cool. All right. Yes. So, any questions about the recommendations that the staff have come forward with on page 124? And now, who's voting on this one? This is A, B, D, E, F, and C sharp. Director Hiltz.
I think I have a question. Okay. So, in the financial stability policy, it talks about annual increases based on inflation. Are we actually following that policy in the budget?
That's a fantastic question. So as it relates to regional water, we used to have, or we still have, a financial model that was built as part of the Comprehensive Regional Water Plan. There was acknowledgement in 2019 that we had deviated from that particular model and recognized that we need to update it. So that particular model did anticipate future requirements, debt funding, and inflationary factors, as well as, operational increases. So are we following that now? And do we have a clear understanding of what our funding needs are for regional water services or the subsequent two reports? No, that's what's on the work plan for this year. Are we following that consistently through other services? Incrementally. So that most certainly is recognition. So whether it's, for our planning fees, our building inspection fees, those types of things, I know everybody's looking at those. Of course, time is a consideration, and that is one of the main purposes of doing these asset management plans, is linking the service delivery to the infrastructure required to deliver the service. So wastewater is a great example of I'm going to use that, our pilot project, our kickoff of what you can foresee for other services in the regional district.
Okay, I have a question about budget proposal number 7. So on the bottom page 125, one of the budget proposals that came forward that we are still considering is an increase to the base budget, $650,000 funded through parcel taxes for capital water main replacement. So the recommendation that staff have come forward with option 1, Schedule B, 43% increase to usage fees and 5.3% increase to parcel taxes. Does that anticipate the full $650,000 or $325 in 2020 and $325 in 2021?
It includes the full $650.
Thank you.
And if I could add, Chair, if that budget proposal doesn't pass, that money just would stay in reserves for a future project.
All right. Any other questions of Tina? All right. How would you like to proceed? Director McMahon.
I would like to move the recommendations on page 124.
So that is option 1, as on page, 127, as indicated. Is there a seconder? Okay. Any other comments or questions? Director Hills.
I'm supportive of the. My question is, and my phrase is the breadcrumbs, but that came from someone else. So, putting in option 1 into it, does that help, like, the public understand what we're actually? Because it's. I'm going. If I was to read this recommendation, I'm going, where does it say that? So I'm just wondering, from a housekeeping, if we just add into the recommendation as per option 1, is that? I'm just wondering about this as a standard, because I'm sometimes have trouble linking that to something 5 or 6, and if I'm having trouble doing it, I'm assuming that the people who aren't sitting around this table might not even try. So I'm just wondering, from a staff point of view, is it helpful, not helpful to have, is in the previous one we had table 11, and this one we don't have it, so in terms of consistency, is that an adjustment to the recommendation? And
so you're saying amend the recommendation. So right now it reads, increase the regional water service area user fees and metered usage rate fees by 43% and parcel taxes by 5.3% for an overall rate increase of 25% as per option 1 on page 127. Or option 1. Okay. And staff?
Thank you, Chair. I just want to point out that the staff reports are not attached to the minutes. So typically when the resolution goes forward to board, we could say as per option 1 in the report, but we would actually lay out what that option is within the recommendation.
So then, on option 1 on the table, it actually has amounts. Would we take those amounts then and put them in to reflect the actual numbers? No?
Thank you, Chair. I just think the increases, as noted in the recommendation on the cover page, is sufficient enough for staff to amend the bylaw rates.
Right, I understand that. What we're saying is, when somebody outside of the regional district is reading this recommendation, they have no idea what these numbers are. Right. So what we're saying is, if somebody else comes and reads this recommendation, how do they know what the number is going to be for them? And is there a way to do that? Tina?
Yeah, in the case of regional water, we're just talking about 2 items. In the prior report, it was 15 services times 2. So sometimes we weigh the amount of content. So typically when there's a significant amount of content, we refer a table. When it's just one or two items, we actually spell it out in the recommendation. We understand, the transparency to that. We could explore including that level of detail, but we haven't. That hasn't been typically our practice.
Director Lee, and I'll come back to that.
I got two comments. First off, that option 1 table, you got a figure wrong under the user fees. The current rate proposed increase is correct. The 2020 rate should be 410.85. This is an average. It's not. You have to actually look at the table before you actually know the figures, because it's different for property sizes and different for everybody. So that's why the wording at the front is actually appropriate as well.
Okay, perfect. So then, to your question, if you add the 287.31, 123.54, you're saying it's not 430.97. 410.85. So then the question to staff would be, what number was used to do the calculation to ensure we have sufficient revenue?
It doesn't matter because it's actually at 43% of the existing rates.
Okay. Staff?
And of course, when the bylaw schedule comes forward, all of those individual rates will be articulated, because of course we have metered rates, et cetera.
Right. But if this number is wrong, this 430.97 should be 410.85, is that a 43% increase? Was something typed wrong? It's the average. Okay. So it doesn't matter what those numbers are at this point. The totals that you calculated are okay. Remco's nodding his head. Okay.
The table before actually has it correct and the same 43%. So.
Okay. Perfect. So just a number put in incorrectly. All right, so we have a recommendation on the floor. Any other questions on the recommendation? All those in favor? Thank you. On to Annex F, pages 138 through 144, South Pender Harbor Water Service Area 2020 Rate Bylaw Amendment. Staff?
So again, the same holds true for both the two subsequent reports for both South and North Pender, where staff are recommending to align that user fees pay for user fees and parcel tax. And again, this was an item that was highlighted as part of the 2019 rate adjustment, and we did an incremental adjustment to that particular year. So therefore, if we do move towards this new alignment, it will mean a 27.5% increase to user rates and a 5% increase to parcel tax rates for an overall rate increase of 17.5. This will eliminate the allocation of parcel tax to fund operations and increase the net capital funding of approximately $150,000 to this particular service. This will also come forward to a future committee in February for bylaw adoption of 422 Schedule E.
Questions? Okay. No questions? Would you like to make a recommendation? Director Lee?
I'd like to make a recommendation that we accept the recommendation.
On page 138, as presented?
On page 138, as presented. Yes.
And there's a seconder? Okay, seconded. And this is voting all directors. Any other questions, comments? Director Hiltz.
Yeah, it's, I'm just contrasting the regional service and the North Pender. There's a couple $100 difference. And so I'm just, from a general perspective, is that an economy of scale issue? Or is there something more, bigger service, lower cost per unit, smaller service, higher cost per unit? Is that generally what we're looking at, or something more to that? I'm sure there's more to it, but to explain to someone why one service is higher than another, is that a reasonable thing to say?
Staff?
Most certainly economies of scale are one factor. I think also just the history of some of these two services when we took on those particular improvement districts back in 2006, 2007. South Pender in particular, we had to construct a new water treatment plant. So we are paying off the debt funding for that new water treatment plant. Now, of course, those infrastructures are needing more improvements because now They're 13 years old, so now some of those budget proposals are also included in here and are factored into the rate review. So yes, economies of scale, but also just what you're having to do to maintain, and there was some deferred maintenance too, so we still have lots of mains replacement work to do in both of those systems. So yeah, and also the geography there is so different. So the cost of doing those projects, you got to do blasting where you might, yeah.
Director Lee?
And North and South Pender are really different places. There's a whole little 100-foot water gap there at the Narrows. I'd really like to see a comprehensive water plan for both North and South. It would seem to me like they should be hooked together, but I think that's a question people are asking in Pender. But to Mark's question, that's exactly, they've developed separately, and so they are separate cost centers, and that's why you have a different rate.
All right, there's a recommendation on the floor. All those in favor? Thank you. Move on to Annex G, North Pender Harbor Water Service Area 2020 Rate Bylaw Amendment, page 145 through 149. Any questions? Would someone like to make a recommendation?
I'd like to make a motion that we accept the recommendations as presented on page 145.
Is there a seconder? Seconded? Any other questions, comments? All those in favor? Thank you. Annex H, Director Remuneration Review Process, pages 150 to 200. And I'll turn over to staff first.
Thank you, Chair. The board has requested a review of director remuneration. The report before you proposes a review process that aligns with best practices identified in the Union of BC Municipalities Council and Board Remuneration Guide. And staff are happy to answer any questions with respect to the process. Thank you.
Director McMahon.
I didn't even have to put up my hand. All right. I have a soapbox and then a couple of minor suggestions, but this is a good report, and the UBCM report was a very good report, so it's a good thing they did this groundwork for us. It saved us a lot of trouble, I think. My concerns with director pay kind of fall into three major categories. One is that I feel pay is unfair to rural directors because we are not adequately compensated for our responsibilities in our constituencies. For instance, I'm the only elected representative for 3,700 people in Elphinstone, and the time required to answer phone calls, emails, inquiries in the grocery store, attend neighborhood and community meetings, the APC, follow up with staff, etc., probably comes in around 20 hours a week, for which I am paid $54.62 biweekly, or $1.36 an hour. By comparison, as a standing committee chair, I'm paid a stipend of $59.68 biweekly, which works out to about $15 an hour, because I would say it's probably 2 hours a week on average commitment, which is actually okay. The second problem is that these are, as I think Director Tice said, perverse incentives. Because we are paid by the meeting and paid double if the meeting goes longer than 3 hours, we are incentivized to hold more and longer meetings and disincentivized to respond to our constituents in the rural areas. Also, the 3-hour limit needs to be looked at because the majority of the work that goes into a meeting is preparation. So whether it runs 2.5 or 3.5 hours is largely irrelevant. The only thing that we need to distinguish is the difference between half-day meetings and full-day meetings, because we do occasionally have full-day meetings. And the third issue is a lack of clarity. Because we are paid by the meeting, every paycheck is different. And, you know, we went through an issue about trying to figure out what we're getting paid for, but it's unpredictable. And most people need a predictable income in order to meet their expenses. And, you know, we've also run into the issue of clarity about what we are and aren't paid for in terms of meetings and conferences. I went to Living Wage Canada and looked up the living wage for the Sunshine Coast, which in 2015, the last time they updated it, was $19.25 an hour, or $40,000 a year. that's not an unreasonable place to start if you are considering, reasonable income. I'm fortunately in the position that I can afford to do this job because I don't have a mortgage and I am a frugal person. And I knew this coming into the job, but I have pursued this issue doggedly because I want to make this position more accessible to a wider range of people, not just retired people with good pensions or the independently wealthy. I come from being a writer, which is why I'm used to being poor. Writers are good at that. And there's an old joke, what do you need to be a writer? And the answer is a spouse with a well-paid full-time job and benefits. And that sort of applies to local politics, too. And it really shouldn't. There should be some attempt to pay a reasonable income. Regarding the report or the terms of reference, I only had 2 suggestions. One is on page 154 under time commitment. I think there should be a reference to responding to constituents' inquiries and concerns, because that does soak up a lot of time. And under responsibility, it mentions that elected officials must accept responsibility for delivering decisions that can be weighty and contentious, which is true, but it might also be worth mentioning that the public exposure involved in politics can significantly affect politicians' personal lives and their families. So.
Yeah. I don't understand.
I've done my bit. Anyone else?
I'll make a comment. So when I go out in public to an event and my husband comes along, he does not want me to introduce him because he doesn't want people to know who he is. And we went out to Calgary for just about 3 weeks over Christmas, and he commented how it was really nice that nobody knew us. So it impacts not only us, as we're sitting here and we're out in the community, but it affects our spouses and our families as well. So there is an impact. I get that. All right. Director Hiltz.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, I'm supportive of the recommendations, and yeah, I think it does add an element of transparency and communicates to the public what this board does. And I like the phrase living wage. And so the question is to staff is, in their research, has that concept come up in terms of a living wage for elected officials? Is that in any of your research, has that been something? And is that something we would embed in? You probably wouldn't put it in the terms of reference, but just a comment about living wage.
So I think that in terms of the UBCM guide, it's been framed not specifically that way, but they get at it in terms when they talk about factors for consideration. And so if we capture those factors, it can be implemented into the evaluation model, for example. So one of the recommendations for evaluation is comparable regional districts. We could add criteria that also examines a living wage to that evaluation methodology, if that's something the board wishes to see.
Okay, so we've got one recommendation that under factors to consider, time commitment also refer to time engaging with the community or responding to constituents' questions, concerns, etc. How would you like that phrased?
Responding to constituents' inquiries and concerns via email, phone, and in person. Would that be?
Okay, so Tara's got that one. And then under responsibility?
I think just before the last sentence, the public exposure involved in politics can significantly affect personal lives and families of politicians.
Okay, and then did you want to, Director Hiltz, did you want to put something in under the review and evaluation process to refer a review of living wage or something?
I'd be happy to have something in there about, in terms of the factors for comparing regional districts, that the living wage be a consideration, yes.
So that would be under 4.3A?
I'd have to turn
Research
to...
and review of current trends and approaches used to set regional district director remuneration levels with a reference to living wage? Or with referral to living wage or something?
Corporate officer was referring to the term factor, so I'm not sure.
Is that in there in the review and evaluation? Yeah. Chair?
So I think, through the chair, Director Hiltz, we're looking at page 155. So I did mention the factors, and we have that context there. But specifically under section 4.3, I think it would be appropriate to add a line that in 4.3A that we also consider a living wage.
So would you add that as a separate bullet or just review or change A itself?
Thank you, Chair. I would recommend that we incorporate it into A, research and review of current trends and approaches, including living wage.
Thank you. All right. Anything else? Director Pratt.
And I support Director McMahon's suggestions, and the piece around the per meeting and the 3 hour, it's, I will say at one of our meetings, Director Seegers gave me an elbow, and she's like, you realize if we let this go a few more minutes, we're going to hit the 3 hours, which we did not want to do. So I actually, I spoke to the CAO about this. I said, I sped up the last couple of minutes of the meeting to make sure that we would not hit that 3 hour. And it's counterintuitive to do this, and I would really appreciate the looking at the flat rate fee or the flat salary fee or however in the wage discussions, looking through that lens rather than the per meeting or the 3 hour, because there's going to be some days that we are going to have those 8 hour days because we're going to have multiple meetings that hit. And we've seen this before. We've hit that 3 hour mark on at least 2 meetings in a long day. And part of that is our learning process. Part of that is a lot of the issues that we're discussing. And that with the rural directors, we have so much other work that we're doing for the constituents, answering questions. And then something to speak to the employment and financial impacts. I mean, for anybody who is self-employed, yep. And with the time commitment and I'm going to say the headspace commitment that this, that being the chair of this board has, I've taken a real step back from my own personal business, and some members of the community, they don't see the delineation between my work outside of this role and have been using that as a fodder for gossip and within other roles that have come back to me through other sources without getting into details. But so it's when you take on a role like this, you are taking it on very publicly. Your family is taking it on as well, and it is we want it to be open to a more broad spectrum of individuals, which I truly believe in order to get the spectrum of our community reflected in our elected officials. We need to be able to encourage them to run and be here in looking at a sustainable financial system.
Director Toth?
I can certainly sympathize with the director's views on this. In December, this job cost my business $20,000. That's a big hit. I think it's 2 years too early, though. I don't think this board should be looking at its own remuneration, and I'll be voting against it.
So I'm going to speak to that. This report, this process, does not actually indicate that it would be implemented at this point. It's doing the work to determine what process would be set up for pay. I think that's a discussion for down the road when it comes back. At that point, we look at when does it get implemented. Does it get implemented now, or do we wait until later on? I don't think that's a reason at this point to hold back on actually doing the work. Director Pratt.
And to speak to that, it is one of the things that the UBCM report identifies as one of the best practices, is to not do it for the sitting board, but to do it for the next board. However, we also had a tax implication last term based on taking away that 1/3 tax exempt status from elected officials, which, so there was an increase last term based on that tax implication. I think in doing this as a task force that the board is not involved with, if they see it as being something that they'd like to see implemented or that they recommend implementing sooner rather than later, because they're operating independently of the board. I've been part of these when I was a school board trustee. I've been on that remuneration committee, and it was set up in their policy that they just automatically reviewed the remuneration in the second year of every term for implementation in the next term. I do think it's something that our task force here will identify if they think it's necessary, and the board can make the decision at that time.
Our director of communications, or our manager of communications in the District of Sechelt, came to us from Fort St. John, and she said they went through this process where they hired a task force, and the task force came back and said, you need an increase, but given the size of the increase that we think you need, we're suggesting you implement it in 3 years. So a bit every year, because you're woefully underpaid, but the tax hit would be too substantial in 1 year. So the task force can make recommendations, and then what we do with those recommendations will be up to us. Okay. Director McMahon?
Wondering if the task force should consider how often elected remuneration should be reviewed. Is that?
I think that's part of the process. Yeah. Director Tighe.
Yes, I support everything that Director McMahon said, and I also commend the path that we're choosing to go with an independent panel. We can see firsthand as to in Revelstoke as to how things go when we don't use that independent panel. So so yes, I think I'd be happy to move those recommendations.
So recommendations on page 150 are moved. Is there a seconder? Seconded. Director Hiltz.
I'd be interested just if Director Toth could expand a little bit on your point of view. I'd just like to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of knew what I was getting into coming into this gig. Personal life has suffered for sure, but I worry about the optics, partly the optics. Largely, I worry about the amount of stuff that we're putting on staff. And I was just mentioning this to Director Kroll. I don't, there's no time window here for sure, but I worry about more stuff on staff at this point when we're already asking so much of them.
Any other questions or comments on the recommendation on the floor? Director Lee.
I will be supporting the motion. I spent a lot of time trying to get someone other than me to run, and I phoned a lot of my younger friends. They were working. They had families and they were working, and they simply couldn't afford to. It ended up the only people that could afford to was people like me. And that's not really, well, I guess we're okay. But it's a big commitment for someone that's retired and wants to spend the last years spending the money they already earned, so that don't leave anything for the kid, And this is really cutting into that. So anything that will make it possible for younger members of our society to contribute in this manner, I think is definitely the right thing to do. I wouldn't like us to be doing it for ourselves, though. But other than that, I'm good. So thank you.
All right, so there's a recommendation on the floor. Any other questions, comments? Director Hills?
I'll just make an equivalence. For me, this review is almost like an asset management plan for, is this board sustainable into the future? So I guess I'm looking at it as that, as a sustainability. And the optics, I'm going, bring it on, like let's show them what we're doing, so, and ask the questions. But I think there's a sustainability issue that if you cannot keep this board with bums in the seats, there's a problem with that. So I think there's this, so I'm looking at almost with an asset management lens.
And I'll just let you know that District of Sechelt will be doing the same thing. Director Pratt?
I wasn't going to bring this up, but I will. The thing is if we don't look at the best remuneration practices possible and a sustainable remuneration, we end up with having a board that is not diverse. And in 2014, we ended up having a very, I'm going to say retired board of only one gender. And that's very definitely not reflective of our community. And we need to have something that is going to encourage other people to run of all ages and all backgrounds. And this is one of the ways that we can do that, and making sure it's sustainable for them to take a considerable amount of time from their lives and from their careers to in the best interests of their community.
All right, so we have motion on the floor. All those in favor? Thank you. So, any opposed? Would you like that recorded? Yes, please. Okay, thank you. So, Annex I, this is with regards to 2020 Sea-Watch parcel tax and utility billing, page 201 and 202. Did anyone who want to speak to this or not? You'll move it? Okay, so moved and seconded. Okay. Any question? Director Lee?
Are we on the Sea-Watch thing?
Yes.
Oh, I think they should pay all of their property taxes on that $1.
Oh, no, this is not property taxes. This is parcel tax and utility billing.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I'm in favor, by the way.
Director Hills.
So we did this last year, and we're doing it this year. So is this going to go until there's a resolution to the Sea-Watch? Is this kind of what we're looking at?
Staff, would this be something we would do every year until this is resolved, or can you do it multi-year?
I think that's kind of what we're so of course we work with our counterparts at the District of Sechelt because we're trying to do this tandemly. So we've both been consulting, and thank goodness we're talking to the same people at the ministry. So there is wording in the legislation for us to be able to do that because they're not receiving the service. So we would have to do a check-in because they're not receiving an exemption. There's nothing in the legislation to say that these properties are exempt. So in the case of the $1, parcel tax are a flat tax, so it's a little bit of that's why we have to treat it this way. So I would imagine we would have to revisit this on an annual basis until there's a conclusion to the status of the properties.
Okay, thank you. So the recommendation is on the floor. Any other comments, questions? All those in favor? Thank you. Annex J, Parcel Tax Roll Review Panel, pages 203 and 204. And as part of this recommendation, we're going to be looking for 3 members of the board who would be willing to sit on that panel. And who, Director Pratt, and then Director McMahon?
I did this last year. I'm happy to do it again. It's like a 5 to 10 minute meeting. We essentially just go through. It's a legislative requirement, so it's pretty easy, and I'm happy to volunteer again.
Director Pratt, Director McMahon?
I didn't do it last year, so I'd like to do it once just to see how it works.
Me too.
Okay, so we've got Pratt, McMahon, and Ties.
And also at this time, do we need to designate who will be the chair of that committee?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay.
I suggest Director Ties.
Okay, Ties as chair.
Last year, we made Director Lee do it, so it's your turn.
All right. All right, so there's a recommendation. Would someone like to make the recommendation on page 203? So recommendation is moved and seconded, and that the three members be Director Pratt, McMahon, and Ties, with Director Ties being the chair. And that's moved and seconded. All those in favor? Thank you. Sorry? It has to go to the board. Yep, that is, it's part of the recommendation, that it's referred to January 23rd regular board meeting for adoption. So J, page 203, 204. So we're moving on to pages 205 to 210, Annex K. This is with regards to 911 communication upgrade. And Tara's also given me a revised recommendation once we get to that. We'll turn it over to Matt Trite.
Thank you. So this project involves two parts, essentially. One side is the replacement of the actual towers, which are old and in many cases damaged. The other side of it is upgrading the communication equipment itself. Much of that is outdated. And as well, moving forward, there's anticipation the next few years we'll have something called Next Generation 911, where people will be able to send information to the 911 dispatchers, not only by phone, but also by text, send pictures, video, live video, and so on. And so if we were able to get in on that, we'll have to upgrade the communications equipment. But obviously, as mentioned, the towers themselves are in somewhat disrepair. And so that's the more expensive part of the project, is to replace those towers at different locations.
Thank you. So the recommendation that I got handed when we came in, I'll read it out to you. So we've got that the report be received, and that the amendments to timeline and scope of existing projects for the Chapman Creek Tower and the Gibsons Tower be amended in budget proposals to 2020 Round 2 budget, and further that new budget proposals be created for 2020 Round 2 budget for future capital upgrades to the 911 communication systems. So it more accurately reflects the information that's in the report. Any questions or comments? Director Lee.
It seems to me like it would be a good plan to partner with one of the communication companies, and if TELUS is interested, why not? But that would keep the cost to us of making the tower. I think that's in the plan. But my other question was, why did Gibsons turn it down originally? I was curious about that. Does anybody know?
My understanding, it was a reaction from the immediate community around the tower. They didn't want it there, so it became sort of a hot potato issue, and it just sort of quietly went away at the time.
Director Lee.
So we'll have to address that as we go, but our plan still is to do that. We moved the one from Madeira Park from the hall to the top of the hill. Did we have to pay for that, or did someone else pay for it for us?
The Cecil Hill one? Is that the one?
Yes.
The equipment we're paying for. The tower, I'm not sure, actually. That was done a little while ago. So I'm not sure if that was, I believe TELUS might have paid for that one, but I'd have to double check on that.
It was a good move. It's good coverage from there.
So a follow-up to Director Lee's comment. Are we in communication with TELUS and the other providers to see if there's any kind of synergies that we can kind of piggyback on?
So TELUS has definitely expressed interest in the Roberts Creek location. They've definitely said they're not interested in the Half Moon Bay location. And our contractors look in contact with other cell providers to see if one of them might be interested in the Half Moon Bay one. That one would be very expensive because there's no power run up to the site we're looking at the water reservoir. And so it would not only be the cost of constructing the tower, it'd be the cost of running power up to that site. So it would probably be almost double the cost of what another tower would be. But it would be an excellent site, though, because of its height, obviously, both for 911 communication and for improved cell phone communication.
All right, Director Ties? And then Director Hill?
Yeah, my question is it says here that there were some negotiations with the RCMP, but none of this has come to fruition. I'm just wondering if you got a little bit more detail as to why that's not happening.
So the negotiations for communications, it's a very specific department within the RCMP. Apparently there's only a couple individuals in the whole country that look after that. And I've contacted them, our contractors contacted them, and it just seems that it gets bogged down. It has really nothing to do with our local detachment or anything like that. It's an entirely separate like I said, department within the RCMP. And at this time, I guess it's just not a high priority for them to deal with. We've, like I said, made contacts, and then we just don't get any responses. And it's been that way for a while. I mean, it is I know they have a lot at stake as far as their communication, and the RCMP does, as far as keeping it secure and so on. But, yeah, we just haven't been able to make any progress. And so we've just set aside any anticipation of working with them on that.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Director Hiltz and then Director Kroll.
Yeah, I think it's a quick question for staff. West Howe Sound, as people may or may not know, hosts the world or the Sunshine Coast tallest freestanding structure, the TELUS Tower up by the bypass. I'm just wondering, does that tower play a role into the 911 communications? Is SCRD involved in that in any way?
We will be putting some equipment on that tower. Yeah.
Director Kroll.
Last year during the fire with Cecil Hill, there were some issues with the tower, were there not, with the power to it was cut off, and then fuel supply to the generators became an issue. So with some of these towers, I'm assuming there's a bit of a juggling act that has to go on to determine the sustainability of the tower, considering it's carrying the 911 emergency service.
Yeah, so that was a bit before my time, so I'm not familiar with that actual incident. But, yeah, with the tower, the backup power, and the area cleared around it is always taken into consideration that in the event of an incident like that, we will obviously need the tower, the communication to continue. So,
Director Ties.
Yeah, in order to prevent what happened in Gibsons to happening in Roberts Creek, I'm wondering if there's some preemptive communication that we can bring out to the community with sort of some, I don't know, scientific research as to how much radiation a tower like this actually produces and what the harm to the population would be, and at what ranges this danger would be posed and all that kind of stuff, because I'm sure there'll be some resistance within the Roberts Creek community to this as well. Just anticipating that rather than being reactive on that.
And also the benefits of the...
Yes, the benefits of them being able to send texts and, get phone calls, and they're not just being around on one or two bars.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? All right, so you have the recommendation. Would you like it read again? No? Okay. So would someone like to make that recommendation? Moved and seconded. All those in favor? Thank you very much. So that's Annex K. We're moving on to Annex L. This is with SCRD Full-Time Equivalent Summary Report. So this is a report that we as a board requested. So we have Mr. Parker here to answer any questions. Who'd like to start off? Did you want to speak to it? Okay.
Thank you very much. The information is, I think, fairly self-explanatory, but it might be helpful just to point out a couple of things. Full-time equivalency, That is a term, or FTE, which is based on someone working full weekly hours. And they can vary from 35 up to 40 hours, but it's basically full-time based on that particular division. The information in the report spans 10 years, and it was actually it was very insightful to look back over these past 10 years and look at how things have changed. We did engage in a restructuring process in 2016. So when you're looking at Appendix A, we couldn't track exactly same to same, but we were able to group the various divisions fairly closely together to give a summary by those areas in terms of how the FTE composition has changed. You can see through the table that back in 2009 it was just over 190 FTEs through to this past year, where the net change is up 7.81 FTEs in that 10-year span. A large portion of that is attributed to the transit expansion that occurred, and it accounts for a fairly significant number. There were other adjustments along the way, but those are all addressed within the various divisions and grouped and sorted. So it was actually, it generated a lot of discussion among staff in terms of seeing this information, and I'm happy to answer any questions the board may have, or the CAS committee may have.
Anybody have any questions? Director Lee, Director Hiltz?
First of all, thanks for this, and I appreciate the way you ordered it. I missed that the first time when I was looking at it. It kind of explains why we're having a little bit of a problem in recreation and parks. It's very interesting. I just wanted to say thanks for doing it, that's all.
Director Hiltz?
Thanks, Jerry. I'm looking at the table, the metrics to compare, and I'm assuming that there's no inflationary items like when you look at a 13% increase on the operating budget, you're not accounting for inflation, just number over number. So is there other metrics that are used to kind of understand an organization, like the tangible capital assets or the backlog of infrastructure? Is there other things that staff had contemplated in terms of presenting how the organization has changed over 10 years?
Thank you for that. There were some other things that we had considered, but they vary greatly from year to year. One of the things that actually isn't highlighted but is worth mentioning is the terms and provisions of the collective agreement and also the exempt staff. One of the things that does happen is as different iterations come forward, some of the benefit entitlements change, and one of the things is associated with leave, paid leave, and in particular vacation. And the longer that staff are employed in pretty much any organization, they reach certain thresholds where they do attract additional vacation. At the same time, different provisions are negotiated, and they do change over time. So while some go up, some might go down at times as well. So it's a factor, but it's very complex and challenging to try and capture it in a meaningful way. So we thought we would stick with just the metrics here that are fairly straightforward, easy to report, but those are definitely some considerations.
Thank you. Any other comments? Tina?
I could just add to the comment is that would be an example that the director is making in regards to the asset management. So when we looked at what we needed in order to meet the requirements of delivering the service, it equated to we should have 3 staff in that particular service. We only have 2 right now, so we already know a shortfall. So some of the factors that were considered in that modeling was some of the factors that the senior manager has articulated. How much leave entitlements do the current staff have? because when we have full-time staff, we know that they're not productive 100% of the time because they might have, 2, 3, 4 weeks of vacation. In some cases, maybe 6 to 8 weeks of vacation. So those are starting to be factored and reviewed.
Okay. New CAO.
One other factor that's incredibly difficult to measure, but has been changing quite significantly over the last 2 or 3 years, is the degree of complexity in which some of the services are offered and the regulatory environments and the additional scrutiny. So while you may have these, they're more easily measured metrics to compare service delivery and staffing levels and dollar values, one of the things that has really changed the amount of time it takes for staff to complete jobs is the swiftly changing regulatory environments, the amount of scrutiny that's on some of these things. You think of managing a recreation center, back in the day it only took this many people to keep the pool open and the arena open, and now with all the additional scrutiny, there's a tremendous amount of additional time. And even just developing services and weaving your way through government processes is more complicated than it used to be. And we noticed that one of the areas that can really cause staff burnout is just the additional time it takes to do things that used to be fairly straightforward and now are incredibly complicated. But it's very difficult to articulate that and to measure it.
Thank you for that. Any other questions or comments, or are we ready to move on? Ready to move on? All right. Thank you for that information. Annex M, compliance with Land Title and Survey Authority of BC legal plans, distribution requirements, pages 214 and 215. And Tina.
Yes, this is just a housekeeping item, Chair, which that the changes to the land titles fee structure, and so we didn't really articulate that in the budget, so we're going to be bringing a budget proposal as part of round 2 to mitigate that particular item.
Thank you. And this is in direct response to all the work that BC government's been doing with regards to land titles. I have to say that as a user of that portal, it's way easier to pull down documents now. It used to be you had to kind of hunt and peck and try and figure out. Coming from Alberta, all through the province of Alberta, every property is recorded the same way. So district lot, the legal is the same for every property. When you come to BC, it's not. There, you've got about 3 different places you can put a district lot number. And so the old system, you had to sometimes it was hunt and pack to find out, is it this order? Is it this order? The new system has made it much easier. So it shifted some of the work from the SCRD back into the province where it should reside. So recommendation on page 214. Moved and seconded. Any other questions, comments? All those in favor? Thank you very much. So up to page 216 through 224, this is the semi-annual report. Any questions for staff on this report? Director McMahon.
Well, I'm delighted to see that our live streaming equipment will come soon. That's awesome. Let's enter the 21st century. Only 20 years late, but what the heck? I was just curious, on page 219, we had a bunch of FOI requests about fire incidents. I was just, why are people asking about fires?
Staff?
It's actually a common FOI request. It's difficult to respond without getting into detail, but sometimes it could relate to insurance, or there might be something going on in the community. But it is a very common, fire-related requests are very common FOI at the SCRD.
I was struck by the almost doubling of Coast Current e-newsletter subscribers in 2019 alone. So page 218, Coast Current e-newsletter subscribers almost doubled within just 2019 alone. So that's good news, and let's see if we can keep that trend going.
Any other questions, comments? I did notice payment. Sorry, I'll come back to you in a second. Let's see if I can get to that. Page 222. This is finance statistics. So number of invoices and payments. No, that's not the right one. Utility billing, MySCRD users. No, page 223. Number of active MySCRD users receiving paper versus electronic invoices, and then payments received for each payment method. It's moving up where they're doing online banking, MySCRD, and going down in person. Do we actually, I mean, I know at the District of Sechelt we're finding that as well. I noticed this year, tax time, our lineups weren't like they've been in previous years because a lot of people are paying online or using our Citizen app, etc. Are we doing any communication around that, any advocacy around that? Because it actually does cut down a lot on staff time if people do it online or do it through an app. So are we actively encouraging people to do that? And over to staff.
Yeah, we do have some campaigns as part of the utility billing process, and we're continuing to look at other means of receiving electronic payment or even plans. So wherever we can reduce people having to do trips to the actual Field Road office, knowing that sometimes there's a geographical constraint to that. So yes, we do, and we sometimes, most certainly our IT department is extremely busy during that time frame because they actually will walk through. We do admit that the platform we're using is not always the most user-intuitive, friendly system. So, but we are trying to make some improvements with the vendor because again, it's related to our land-based based system, so we don't really have a choice on how to configure it. So yes, we try to, and we try to advertise. We put it in the utility bills, but always looking to ways to continue to improve that.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Director McMahon?
I just had a couple. On page 219, it looks like our first aid track record has improved. Are we much safer this year than previous years?
Thank you for that. The efforts that are going on with regards to the establishment and support to our joint health and safety committees have been tremendous. There's a lot more involvement. A lot of that is shifting towards a more proactive approach to safety in the organization. So the key thing, I guess, is that it's information sharing where we're looking at things that apply not just at work but also at home. And it's trying to keep people well informed, keep a focus on safety, and we keep exploring wellness programs as well. So watch for something in the near future, I hope, where we can move towards that. At the end of the day, it's been helpful having both a corporate safety officer and the HR advisor spend a lot of time with claims management. And we're seeing some positive results as well in the expenditures for both WorkSafe premiums and also this current year we've actually seen a reduction in our premiums with regards to Pacific Blue Cross. So it's a good news story, and we're hoping to just keep that trend alive. And I think this board getting behind NAOSH Week was also really great. So there's a little plug. Watch for 2020.
Good. We'll go Director Hiltz and then Director McMahon.
I just wanted to respond to that in person versus in my time in local government, which is like over 25 years. People at the front counter used to say sometimes the only encounter that a resident have with the local government is when they come in to pay their utility and tax bills. So, and a chance to browse their lobby and pick up information. So, as much as, from a processing, you do it online, but that contact, it is a concern that I have, and that's about the package that goes out to the public and what's in that package. But it is a concern that I have. Is we become the black box, like my BC Hydro just goes out in the mail, and I don't know where BC Hydro is, and you lose that contact. So it's just something that people have talked about over the years.
I understand, and I think that this morning with our wastewater, right? We need to do more of that kind of engagement rather than come and pay your bill, right? So it's a different focus. So I agree. I mean, we need to have more engagement, but it doesn't have to be that way. All right, Director McMahon.
Right, on page 223, utility accounts with balances outstanding. That seems to be increasing fairly a lot, and 746 unpaid bills out of how, what percentage of bills are not paid, and why, and do we ever get paid?
Staff.
Yeah, so it's in the neighborhood of 10 or 15%. Last year, if you recall, and we were closely looking, there was a campaign, as you recall, on social media to boycott paying your utility bill until water was addressed. So we didn't know what the impacts of that. We seem to have a very slow uptake in utility bills, so everybody paid very quickly at the end of the deadline, and some people missed the deadline. And so we had send reminder bills, et cetera. And so the legislative process, so to answer your question, do people pay us? Yes, these particular amounts get transferred to tax, so we do recover it somehow.
Any other questions about the report? Let's move on to Annex O, 2020 Rural Grant Areas Grant and Aid Timelines. This is pages 225 and 226. And it requests that we approve the timeline. The timeline is actually indicated in the conclusion of the report. Director Tice.
So yeah, my question is are these timelines in fact moving forward as we adjust our budgets? Timelines.
Staff?
So we are adopting our financial plan a little earlier, and so this is what a typical grant and aid process would be. So we haven't moved the timelines up. Part of the consideration with rural grants and aid is the payment date. So regardless of when we actually administer or award the projects, in the policy, and because we don't receive our tax money until August 1st, that's partly why these particular timelines have been done. There's also some consideration where user groups who require funds ahead of that particular payment, there's a special consideration for that. So again, it's just based on cash flow requirements. So if there is a requirement or a desire to change this process, we can. I know there's even been discussion of having 2 intakes. So those are more policy-related discussions.
Anybody else like to weigh in on this one? Director Pratt?
The 2 intake piece, did the board actually give any direction on that, or did we just discuss it but no direction? Because that is a question I'd like to put to the other rural directors.
It was discussed but no subsequent motion to that.
Director.
Seems to me that we did end up with a number of special cases that came in after the deadline, which is probably not ideal, dealing with things one-off rather than having a second intake. Maybe we could, I'm not willing to come up with something on the fly here, but I think it's something that we should give consideration to, and maybe staff could look at it. Certainly the town does 2 intakes, and the first intake is the major intake. So
would you like that for this year, or are we looking at running with what we have for this year, but requesting staff look at the potential of and the impact of a 2 intake for next year?
I would say for 2021, not 2020. It's too tight to do it now, and I don't want to. We've given staff a lot to do this year, but maybe for 2021, looking at a policy direction for 2021 at doing 2 intakes for rural grant and aid.
Okay, would you like to make a motion to that effect?
Yes. Would it be in the form of a staff report? Staff to report back to a future committee meeting, CAS meeting of potentially moving to a second intake for RGIA.
Implications, timelines.
And funding breakdown.
Funding breakdown. Okay.
Is that
Seconder?
clear enough?
Seconder for that first. This is rural areas only. Someone like to second that recommendation? Second it? Okay. And then you want to speak to that, Director Command?
There's also the question of the alignment between the various governments. From the point of view of people who are applying, having every local government have a completely different deadline and a different process is trying, particularly if you're going for like $500 and you're taking 15 hours to do it. So I don't know. I don't know who we would kick that over to, because I realize there's reasons.
So historically, when I was on, I'm just going to address this first. When I was first on the SCRD board, so this would be back in 2012, 13, we were looking at addressing, could we have some kind of similar application form, similar process, time frame? And so a number of us from the various governments got together and we looked at all of our processes. And what ended up happening, we basically abandoned the process, and because each one of the governments has different criteria, and the criteria actually impacted everything else. So we couldn't even come up with a similar application form or process or timeline or whatever. It just wasn't possible. Right? So I mean, we spent considerable time on that. Didn't work. All right, Director Kroll and then Director Lee.
Something for consideration if you are doing 2 intakes. The town of Gibsons has a grant and aid budget amount, period, but we have the 2 intakes. And as Director McMahon mentioned, the first intake tends to be the popular one, so most of the budget is blown in the first intake, and then we're scrambling in the second intake, trying to, divide, what's left in the budget between some really worthy causes. So I'd certainly recommend that if you're doing 2 intakes, that you set a budget amount to each intake. And sort of further to Director Seeger's comments, we have 2 amounts, like under a certain amount, it's a short application. Over a certain amount, it's a long application. But it's just food for thought.
And our application process has moved online now. Yes. Director Lee.
I don't know about the 2 intake. I can only see it working the way David suggested, and that is give a lot at first and a little in the middle. But I would like, if we could, somewhere in the middle of the year, have a process where we could have an agenda item about whether we do want to spend the rest of our grant and aid, and if we have applications in. I put it reverse of what I was thinking, and that is that some needs come up during the year that can't wait. And if we knew we were going to discuss it, we could keep those, and we also could solicit some of our organizations to say, well, we have a little bit of money left. You might want to compete for that, seeing you have this project this far along. That would seem like a good thing, because I was always under the impression you got her the first time or you never got her. So I was a little surprised to see that we did give grant and aids out during the year, which was a surprise to me. But it seemed like the right thing to do after we did do it. So maybe we want to kind of formalize that opportunity is what I was thinking.
So the recommendation on the floor is that staff come forward to a future CAS meeting with regards to potentially moving to 2 intakes. And at that point, we'd have a discussion about what that would look like. Okay. So all those in favor of the recommendation on the floor? Rural areas only. Thank you. That's passed. So let's move back to the recommendation on page 225 with referral to the timeline on page 226. Director Pratt?
I'd just like to move those recommendations, please.
Director McMahon, second. Any other questions, comments? All those in favor? Thank you. That's Annex O. Annex P, 227 to 231 with regards to long-term debt as at December 31st, 2019. And did you want to speak to this, or we just see if there's any questions?
Questions, Chair.
Any questions from the board? Director Pratt.
Just a reminder of how much municipal debt, what's the percentage of muni debt that we can be responsible for? I can't remember that number.
It's actually not the amount that the regional district is responsible for. It's how much the member municipal entities can borrow. So that's legislated by their debt servicing certificate, which is monitored by the province as well as the Municipal Finance Authority.
Yeah, we have limits on what we can borrow. And there's two sets. One is a certain percentage, and the other is something, I forget the other. Percentage of revenue is one, but there's something else as well. Yeah, there was a calculation. So, but regional district has no limits. Well, I mean, we have no statutory requirements.
There's not a statutory, but the SCRD does have a debt management policy, and
yes.
so it is it's articulated in there, which is very similar to that of the municipalities.
Right. Right, where ours is statutory. Like, once we get to those limits, we cannot legally borrow anymore. Okay. Yeah. Tony gives it the same way. Any other questions about the report? All right, let's move on to the next one. Annex Q, contracts between 50 and 100,000 from October 1st to December 31st, 2019, pages 232, 233. Any questions on any of these contracts? Director Hiltz?
Yeah, I guess 2020 is going to be the first full year of reporting under the new procurement policy that came from last year. So is there anything kind of different that we're going to see in terms of the reporting? That this is, I'm not sure how it was all fitting together, the new policy and the reporting. And
so one of the changes was the increase. We used to report for things between 25,000 and 100,000 because both the delegation bylaw and purchasing policy, anything over 100,000 comes to the board for approval. So we did increase that. One of the other parts of the policy that has changed quite dramatically is the social procurement side. And so what we could look to is reporting to that either in the biannual report or in this particular report here. The purpose of this one is really just to report an amount. Any kind of other negotiate agreements, that'd be articulated both in maybe staff reports, but could be part of the biannual report as well.
Any other questions on the report? Let's move on to Annex R. This is Director Constituency and Travel Expenses for period ending January 23rd through 2020, and this has already been received, so any questions? Tina?
Just noting that our year-end cutoffs have come out, so if you've submitted them, they will be in your 2020.
Thank you. No questions. Let's move on to communications. First, motion to receive the communication. Moved and seconded. All in favor? Thank you. And this is voting A, B, D, E, and F. This is a letter with regards to Cooper's Green New Hall from Don Cunliffe, the director from the Half Moon Bay Community Association. And how would you like to deal with the letter? Or would you like to deal with the letter, or just receive it?
I'd be happy to, as board chair and director from Area B, to send a lovely thank you back to the committee because I do not believe there's any additional information at this time. So I think it's just a thank you.
Okay. And do you need a motion for that, or are you just going to do that?
I think I can just do that. I don't need a motion for that. Oh, I'm sorry. I see the corporate officer would appreciate a motion, so I'll make a motion that I send a letter.
Okay. Is there a seconder for that recommendation? Yes, seconded. Electoral areas only. All those in favor? Thank you. So, motion to go in camera under sections 91A, C, and K of the Community Charter. Like a motion to that effect? Moved to seconded. All in favor? Thank you. And we'll turn to the